Hello everybody, if you're listening to this at the time of release, it's a few days or a couple of days possibly before the end of the year, so it's time for the Patreon Drydock, the last Patreon Drydock of 2024, episode 330. So of course we have an awful lot of questions, and let's just get stuck right into them. Lord Druken asks, what is the difference between an iron-hulled ship and an ironclad one? I have seen the former term used, both in your videos and elsewhere, but never understood what differentiates it from an ironclad. This is one of those cases where the technical definition and the colloquial definition are actually quite distinct in some cases, but the colloquial definition has come into far more common use and therefore in a lot of ways has actually supplanted the technical definition, but you'll see why in a minute. So an iron-hulled ship essentially means, well, that the hull of the ship is built of iron. So the keel, the frames, the ribs, and usually also the hull plating, although not necessarily always, because you can have composite ships which might be described as iron-hulled, so their overall framework is made of iron, but they might be planked for the exterior, well, hull planking instead of hull plating. So very technically speaking, an iron-hulled ship is one where, if you like, the skeleton of the ship is built of iron. But more colloquially, people would expect iron-hull to also mean iron-hull plating. So you can look at either of those. But the important thing about that is that an iron-hulled ship purely describes a vessel whose fundamental structure is iron. It doesn't say anything about the protection or lack thereof on a ship. So more typically, an iron-hulled ship would describe a vessel that, as said, has some form of iron in its hull, either the framing and general structure or perhaps also the plating, but is not armoured. An ironclad vessel, now this is where there is a big difference. The colloquial meaning of ironclad is a vessel that, again, clad in iron, but more specifically clad in iron for protective purposes, i.e. an armoured vessel using iron plating. Now, very technically, at the time, and theoretically even now, ironclad means a vessel that is not iron, that has been clad in iron to protect it. So Gloire, for instance, would be an ironclad vessel. By the exact technical definition, HMS Warrior is not actually an ironclad because she isn't a wooden-hulled vessel that has had iron applied for protective purposes. She is an iron-hulled vessel with armour, so she is just an armoured ship. But, of course, that's not how people as a whole at the time and the media and so forth saw it, and very quickly ironclad came to simply mean a ship that was armoured with iron plating, regardless of what exactly the hull was made up of, whether it be iron keel, iron frames, iron hull plating, some wood backing to absorb splinters and iron armour, which is Warrior, or whether it be a wooden vessel, so wooden keel, wooden ribs, wooden planking, with iron armour added on top, and perhaps with iron strapping and reinforcement inside, which was fairly common in the 1850s and 1860s. It could just be a purely wooden vessel that for whatever reason didn't need iron strapping and just had iron slapped on top. But as a general rule of thumb, if you see someone describing a ship as iron-hulled, that usually means it's unarmoured, but its structure is made of iron. Whereas if you see someone describing something as an ironclad, it means it is armoured, at least in part, with iron, because it, technically speaking, ships armed with compound armour are also ironclads, even though part of their armour is steel. And indeed, by the time of the last ironclads, or perhaps compound clads if you want to be more technically accurate, their hulls are actually steel, not iron, so technically speaking, the ironclad definition actually works for them even better than it does for something like Warrior, because it is two different materials. The Rogue Chief asks, concerning the Lexingtons, if the Navy hadn't been so determined on turbo-electric drive and gone with steam turbines instead, what could they have done with the design in both their battlecruiser and carrier configurations? Could they at least have foregone the treaty cheating? Well, the power plant in both carrier and battlecruiser configurations is going to be pretty much the same. But if they'd gone with geared turbines instead of turbo-electric drive, of course, they would have saved some weight and space. Now, in terms of what this would have done to the design, for the carrier conversion, as I said, not a lot, because they're taking the baseline hull. They're not going to change out the machinery or overall change the lower part of the hull, just because they're switching from battlecruiser to carrier. But if they had gone with geared turbines instead of turbo-electric drive, it would have saved, as I said, weight and space, and that may have affected the overall hull design in the first place, given that, of course, they were initially looking to try and get the Lexingtons up to 35 knots to keep pace with the Clemsons, Wixes, and Omahas, although by the time the final iteration of the Lexingtons as battlecruisers came out, they had dropped that requirement. But still, it would have either made it easier to do so, or get closer to it, because of course you could put more volume and more weight into supplying power to the geared turbines, which would increase your speed, or you could make refinements to the hull form, or both. Or alternatively, if the decision to switch had perhaps come at the same time as they decided, actually, we're not going to hit 35 knots, we'll go for 33, then they could have done something like increase the amount of armour present, which might have been an advisable idea, which, of course, once it comes to conversion, they could remove that armour and thus save up even more weight for the carrier conversion. But in terms of could they have foregone the treaty cheating, essentially what you're looking at, given the exemptions that they carved out. So they carved out an exemption for 2 oversized carriers for everyone, although the British didn't take up that option. And then, because the US wasn't going to meet that requirement, even with the increased tonnage, they then kind of cheated by putting the 3,000-ton additional weight that you were allowed to do for refits on right at the start. And even then, they were a bit heavier than that. But let's say that we're looking to save at least around 3,000 tons, because although that wouldn't allow you to completely not cheat the treaty, it would allow you to only cheat the treaty by including that 3,000 ton limit, because you're still running over a bit, but you're essentially bringing the over and over bit into the just over, which we can kind of paper over to claim it's compliant. Or, you never know, if we can save more than 3,000 tons, that might actually be enough to bring it within the technical limitation as agreed in the Washington Treaty. Anyway, if you look through the various applicable Friedman books, so US battleships, US aircraft carriers, US cruisers, because you need to look at all three to understand the Lexington class, and the comparisons between turbo-electric and geared turbine ships that were done both before and after the Lexingtons in especially US capital ship construction, the highest figure for weight saving, because let's be a little bit generous here, in comparative studies between otherwise identical ships in terms of armour, speed and firepower, was 40%. So the geared turbine machinery was 40% less weight than the turbo-electric machinery. Now, if we apply that to the Lexington class, as completed, their machinery weight was just a fraction under 6,900 tons. So that would, if we take 40% off of that, give us a figure of around 4,100 tons of machinery, which means we're actually saving 2,800 tons or thereabouts. Now, that's not enough to bring Lexington and Saratoga under the notional 33,000 ton limit, but it is more than enough to bring them comfortably within the 33,000 ton plus 3,000 ton kind of refit displacement limit, which was slapped on technically treaty breaking. So if we accept that whilst it's rules lawing to its finest, we're going to allow that extra 3,000 tons to be slapped onto the 33,000 tons, then yes, switching over from turboelectric to geared turbine machinery would bring the Lexingtons well within that version of treaty limits. And also, rather interestingly, when you look at the various battleship design studies, it also talks about saving about 20 to 30 feet in overall length of a ship. So it's not just the machinery weight itself, but also the overall weight of the hull. So if they decided to shorten up the hull, and I said they might not because they might want to try and keep going for speed, but if they had shortened up the hull, that might actually have brought them within the 33,000 ton limit overall, especially because, of course, 20 to 30 feet is cited for battleships that are expected to be doing 23 to 28 knots, depending on whether you're looking at 1920s or 1930s design studies, whereas the Lexingtons with that much greater machinery, you might say even say 40 feet of hull space by reducing the machinery by going with geared turbines. John McDonough asks, my question is, why all the effort to refloat USS Oklahoma? It would seem to me that simply scrapping her in place would have been a far more economical choice and taken much less time. I know there were issues with recovering human remains, but that could have been accounted for. It seems like an awful lot to go through for what turned out to just be a large barge. It comes down to two factors: the location of the Oklahoma generally, and also how she sank. So you can see here, this is the main part of Battleship Row. Well, this is Battleship Row itself. California is obviously a little bit off further away. But you can see where Oklahoma is on the outboard side of essentially the first position. So her sinking in any way, shape or form in that location blocks off access to a good chunk of the capital ship anchorage on that side of Ford Island. And indeed, it took a while for them to actually free poor old Maryland, even though Maryland wasn't actually that badly damaged, to get her out of there. Same thing actually with Tennessee. They were essentially trapped by the wrecks of Oklahoma, West Virginia, and Arizona. Now, there is an additional problem, which is that Oklahoma, when she sank, capsized and ended up rolling a little bit to the port side of the position that she's indicated here, so actually into the navigational channel. So she absolutely had to be removed, because she was not only then blocking access to essentially the first and second main anchorage points, but also was something of a navigational hazard for anything trying to generally get in and out of Pearl Harbor as a whole. But if she was scrapped in place, that would mean quite a long time with lots of shipping. I say shipping, loose barges, flats, boats, and some ships, crane ships and so forth, gradually breaking her up underwater with divers, which would have been fairly hazardous and would have obviously involved them spreading out not just over but around the ship. So not only would that further block off access to the anchorages, because theoretically, at least once West Virginia had been raised, that would in theory open up access to the second anchorage point where Tennessee and West Virginia had been. Obviously, Arizona's occupying the third section, and Nevada went off anyway, so the fourth was always open. But if you've got a large salvage and scrap in place operation going on, that's going to block access to that second anchor point, and those ships, unless you want the process to take forever and a day, are also going to be intruding out even further into the navigational channel than Oklahoma's wreck itself would have done. Therefore, weird as it might sound, the work that was actually done to essentially secure the hull, roll it over, and bring it to the surface was the least intrusive version of dealing with the wreck, whilst the base as a whole was still obviously a very active frontline base during the Pacific campaign. And at least early on, there was also a little bit of hope that Oklahoma might actually be salvaged and returned to service, because if you look at the absolute pounding that West Virginia had taken, and she was considered worthy of bringing back into service, Oklahoma had actually taken, proportionally speaking, less direct combat damage, but then rolled over. So there was a thought that maybe we roll her back up the other way and she might be able to go back into service. As it turned out, the results of the capsizing and some of the damage done in hauling her upright meant it was impractical to return her to service, combined, of course, with the fact that she was a much older and therefore less useful ship than West Virginia, but that was a small factor in the planning as well. Rebel Skverl asks, I've recently joined the International Kriegspiel Society and have been enjoying playing their games based on the same general principles as the original war game developed by the Prussians as a training tool for their officers. Do you know when navies began to use their own version of such games to train officers and test strategies and tactics? Yes, well, actually, there's a short paper published in King's College London which discusses research into naval wargaming, but it points out that although there is a notional amount of evidence that some form of tabletop wargaming in the naval context was played off and on by various people all the way back to sort of Roman and earlier times, it tended to sort of just come and go. Nothing really substantial of it compared to when navies went, actually, you know what, we're definitely using this. When that happened, started around about the 1870s, and then obviously subsequently onwards, that's kind of when it caught on properly. And there's a few different reasons for that. If you go back much prior, then ships had to be exercised and taken out quite regularly anyway to stop them rotting and to keep their crews at a high tempo of operational capability. So if you wanted to do what we would describe as a war game, well, your, let's say, age of sail vessels, if they're going out there anyway, they might as well, practice some fleet maneuvers and so forth. But in terms of the overall larger strategy of maneuvering and formations and so forth, a lot of it was pretty standard. Either line of battle or break the line, and also the number of variables that would be in place at any given time, such as wind direction and speed and so forth, was such that it didn't really lend itself to a wargaming rules, because you'd have to invent some very, very complex rules to simulate the effects of a changing wind all the time for Age of Sail wargaming. And then, who are you going to have a third party who's going to arbitrarily be changing the weather the way it would actually change in a historical Age of Sail engagement and the lead up to it? Whereas by the time you get to the 1870s, which is when it all kicks off, you have fleets that are now pretty much entirely steam-powered, so they can maneuver independent of the wind, and suddenly having rules about, well, this ship can go this far and can turn this much, and we can try and outmaneuver the enemy without have much regard for the weather. That suddenly becomes a lot more important. The exact range of engagement dictating how much damage you can do, if any, because of obviously armour and gun penetration and so forth, which wasn't an issue in the Age of Sail. That's all come into vogue, and you can codify that into rules. Ships themselves have become a lot more expensive, and therefore just randomly taking entire squadrons out to test out tactics, while it was done, full-scale wargaming, because it's a lot more expensive, if you can, say, iterate 20 ideas down to 2 or 3 to try out in full scale, then that's a big utility for naval wargaming on the tabletop. And of course you can do it in poor weather. And the other factor is that because ships and such are getting a lot more expensive, the actual overall numbers of ships are coming down, and because you're in the middle of the imperial period, for, well, the bigger navies at least, those navies are also a lot more spread out than they used to be. Or at least, what's left in home ports is proportionally quite small, and that makes it much harder to run a full fleet exercise. And therefore, if you want to try and work out, well, what happens in the event of war, if we concentrate all our ships in this area and we fight this other person who's concentrated all their ships in that area, that's a lot harder to do without actually physically recalling a good chunk of your fleet, which might actually accidentally perpetuate a war, because people would think you're planning something. But if you do it on the tabletop, you can iterate, rather than spend several days having spent an awful lot of money and several months dragging your fleet back to one location. You could instead spend an afternoon or a day iterating out 4 or 5 different versions of a battle. Robert Henry Ilston asks, why weren't the radio aerials strung from fore to aft on the big capital ships damaged during combat? Well, sometimes they were, but fundamentally the reason why very often they weren't was just they're incredibly hard to actually damage, because there are a long series of wires strung between masts, and then the masts themselves are also pretty small. So if a shell lands on the ship and explodes, the shockwave or the blast wave of the shell will be very strong, but of course a metal wire is pretty strong as well, especially in tension. And given how thin they are, the amount of actual pressure being exerted on the wire as opposed to passing by the wire is relatively minimal. So unless a shell blast was incredibly close, the chances of the blast itself cutting a radio antenna cable was pretty slim. Now, of course, they could be more directly cut by shell fragments, but again, the fact they represent a very, very small target area compared to the general blast and the volume of space that shell fragments are flying through, especially if they've gone from the deck of the ship all the way up that high, is such that most shell blasts, the fragments just statistically won't hit them, which means that outside of sheer bad luck, the 3 primary ways for an aerial cable to be disrupted would be for either a direct or near direct hit by a shell. So obviously then the splinters and the blast wave are a lot more concentrated and might exert enough force or actually hit the aerial. But that would require a shell to hit and detonate on the mast itself near the anchoring points of the cables. Or, second option, for a shell to do what a lot of people feared might happen, which is to hit a mast and collapse it or partially collapse it in such a way that it rips the aerials apart or severs the connections to them, which the latter bit of that did occasionally happen. Or the third, extremely rare, but we do have 1 or 2 cases of it actually happening, which is why this particular picture is up here, which is to exert such force on the ship that the cables are torn apart. And we know that this happened in the run to the south at the Battle of Jutland. German battlecruiser gets hit aft by a 15-inch shell from a Queen Elizabeth class, and the impact of that shell and its subsequent detonation is such that the stern of the German battlecruiser starts oscillating back and forth with such violence that its mainmast, which is the aft mast, also oscillates back and forth with such violence to the point that even the slack in those aerial cables is taken up and the cables are pulled apart by the amount of force involved. So those are ways in which the radio aerials could and were damaged, but they are statistically incredibly unlikely to happen in general combat, and therefore it wasn't very common. Koen van Kruining asks, in an earlier Drydock you mentioned that in the 19th century there was little secrecy about advanced naval technology compared to what you'd expect nowadays. Why were navies not so secretive about their best technology back then? Some of it was pure practicality. These days, of course, an awful lot of what constitutes naval technology, and even to a certain extent in the earlier part of the 20th century, is below decks, or otherwise somewhat concealable, and even if it's exposed, you might not be able to iterate exactly what its capabilities are or even what it does without physically examining the thing up close. So, these days, for example, if you look at a flat panel radar array, or even spinny dome radars, just seeing them doesn't really tell you all that much about what makes them tick. What are the materials used to make the receivers? You can't tell that unless you physically have one in your hand. Therefore, it's actually worth concealing that information, because then it will conceal the exact capabilities of that system from your enemies. Of course, you can publish something and say, it does this, but that's probably not actually true. And even back in the early 20th century, radar fire control systems, even to a certain extent the physical makeup of shells and how good your fuses are. These are all things that can be concealed. And actually, by that point, technological development has got to the point where that might actually offer you a significant advantage. So it's worth doing. Whereas, even if we just look at the ironclad and pre-Dreadnought period of the late 19th century, because in the age of sail, well, cannon is a cannon is a cannon. Nobody particularly cares, and you're probably going to capture examples anyway. But fundamentally, cannon technology is not massively different. But even in the latter period, like you can see in the picture here, as you can tell, if ships are anchored within a few dozen yards of commercial and residential properties, outside of their machinery, almost everything else about them is either going to be pretty standard. A shell fuse is a shell fuse is a shell fuse. There might be marginal differences in performance in the 19th century, but not all that much. But everything else, how many torpedoes does the ship carry? How large are they? How big are the guns? How many are they? How long is the ship? What's its profile? All of that can be told by either someone with a good pair of eyes or a basic set of binoculars, so why bother concealing it? And similarly, shipyards were not as large as they are today in terms of their sort of security beaten zone. So while you would have restrictions on who could actually physically access the ships, it wasn't anywhere near as restricted as it is these days. And honestly, you could just take a boat or go into, a 2 or 3 or 4 story building and see pretty much anything you wanted to see, regardless of whether you were physically up close and personal with the ship. So there was a lot of practicality involved. The other aspect was that, kind of a dual thing, technology was advancing incredibly rapidly in the latter part of the 19th century. And after the first couple of years, pretty much everyone realized this. So while there was a certain benefit in maybe not making things entirely public until the ship was either well under construction or launched, even then, the fact that everybody, let's say, knew that you were going to stick a 100-ton gun on your ship wouldn't necessarily help them all that much because, well, 5 years down the line, there might be a 150-ton gun. So knowing that isn't going to help them for all that long. But also, if they know you have a 100-ton gun, but they are physically incapable of manufacturing a 100-ton gun, or they haven't started yet, the time and development to do so, even if their industry can, is such that, well, who cares if they know? By the time they've figured out how to get their hands on a similar weapon, we'll have a better one. But another big factor was that a lot of this technological advancement was not actually taking place in the navies themselves. Some of it was, like Froude's work on how you should make and shape a ship's hull form, and that was, to a certain extent, actually kept under wraps. But huge amounts of it were being made by private companies in terms of, gun manufacturers, armor manufacturers, engine manufacturers, private shipyards, etc. And there was a lot less regulation on those industries in general, not just secrecy, back in the 19th century. And they would quite happily sell that technology to pretty much anyone who asked. So there's no point in a navy saying, oh, well, we're not going to tell you about the capacity of our new 6-inch gun because Vickers will just sell you one. Going to the Royal Navy and asking for information, well, who cares? We'll just go to the manufacturer and buy one and look at it ourselves, and Vickers will sing its praises and capabilities to the rooftops because they want to ensure a sale. And the same thing with Krupp over in Germany. There's no 19th century version of ITAR or anything like that. If you want to buy engines, guns, shells, armor, whole warships, just go to a commercial builder and they'll do it. Now, obviously, at that stage, the various governments could step in to a certain extent and say, we don't want you commercially selling war material to this particular nation because either we don't like them as a whole or we don't think it's politically advisable. But you could just go and buy from a nation that did like you. And given the complex interplay of the great powers in the 19th century, if Britain didn't like you, well, go buy Krupp guns. If Germany doesn't like you for some reason, go and buy British guns. If neither of them like you, buy French guns. If the whole of Europe doesn't like you, buy American guns, and so on and so forth. Sam Signorelli asks, even before the existence of Mini-Drac, you seemed incredibly busy. How do you structure your time, both before and after your child's birth, in order to keep up your rate of production, especially at such quality, and still have a life outside of the channel? On my own channel, mostly focused on the art of armoury for the Olympic sport of fencing, I'm only just now able to build up a degree of videos produced in advance, but it took me years to get to the point where I could do so, and I don't have your real-life commitments. As it stands at the moment, there's quite a few different factors. I've mentioned some of them before, but, well, you asked, so you get the answer. Partially, it's due to the fact I actually genuinely enjoy what I do. Now, for those of you who were working from home during the pandemic a few years ago, you'll understand where I'm coming from. I found that when I was doing my office engineering job, I was slightly overloaded. So notionally I should be there working, not including lunch breaks, for about 7.5 to 8 hours a day. But I found I was effectively having to deal with probably 9 to 9.5 hours a day of work, including things like site visits and meetings. Once I transitioned over to the working from home paradigm in 2020 and 2021, I suddenly discovered that although I was doing exactly the same amount of work, it was taking me half or less the time because, well, I didn't have all the distractions inherent in office working. That pointed me towards, okay, I can actually produce a lot more in terms of work output when I don't have A, the distractions, and B, when I have the motivation. Because, of course, if I'm working from home, if I complete the work I need to do for that day, my motivation is I can sit back and relax until the next email comes in, even if that's 10 minutes later. Whereas if you do that in the office, someone will start bugging you about, why aren't you working? At which point you work, even subconsciously, but perhaps also consciously work out how to draw out what you're doing so that you are never actually seen to be not working. Plus, while I was good at engineering, I essentially discovered that in the public sector, so in the UK, that is the sort of working for local government, and in the private sector, there was an awful lot of stuff that you had to deal with that really wasn't all that pleasant. So in the private sector, you have to deal with office politics mostly, and people with timesheets and time codes and all that kind of nonsense. And in the public sector, you have to deal with actual politics. Whereas if I'm working mostly from home on naval history, I don't have to deal with office politics because I am the office. I'm not exactly going to start an office conspiracy against myself. And unless I'm dealing with politics of people who are 50 years or more dead, I don't have to deal with actual politics either, which is great. So just having the motivation means I can sit down and work on stuff and produce a lot more content a lot more efficiently than I would if I was doing exactly this job as an office job. Another element, which to be fair is a bit of a genetic advantage, is that, as I've mentioned before, I have a mostly functioning eidetic memory. Annoyingly, up until about 2012, I had an actually fully functioning eidetic memory, but various shenanigans which led to some major health concerns related to one of the companies I worked for and was working for at the time, meant that those health concerns escalated to the point where I actually suffered damage to my memory. So my memory is not as good as it used to be, but it's still mostly there. And the reason that helps with research is that if I come across something pretty important, I will tend to remember it. I don't need to look it up again. And also I'll remember the context in which I found it, which makes it easier to find again if I need further information about that, which cuts down on the amount of time you need to do research because you're not having to retread old ground. So, for example, someone recently asked about the USS North Carolina's torpedoing, and while I was looking through the damage diagrams, the damage reports that have been produced, the thing was that one of the elements of what they were asking was where could the torpedo have hit and potentially have done more damage. And I remembered from doing my research for HMS Hood and how she blew up, and then subsequently finding that the North Carolina class during their design process had identified pretty much the weakness that I think killed Hood, that they'd emergency installed some 3-inch or thereabouts armour behind the torpedo defence system abreast of the magazines, and as such I then wasn't that surprised when looking at the damage control diagrams. There's a 3-inch plate behind, labelled theoretically as a torpedo bulkhead, abreast the magazines, but obviously well back of the 12-inch armour belt. And then when I saw that, well, actually, you know, that you've got this curling over, and the greatest amount of damage at that point within the ship's TDS is immediately above and below that 3-inch bit of armour, that wasn't a surprise. And then I immediately knew that this is something I could explain as part of the answer in terms of, well, you can see the physical evidence of why having this rigid plate is actually a bad idea, and therefore if the torpedo impact had been just before or just after this 3-inch strike, so probably maybe where the forward bulkhead is on the North Carolinas, that would be the worst place for the damage to occur, because not only would you get the damage spilling over and concentrating at top and bottom, but also along the side, which could lead to a big shear area. Now, of course, that required me to do research on Hood, which then led to the discovery about the North Carolinas, plus other research on how torpedo defense systems worked. But all of that I've done over half a decade or more, but it all is there in my mind. So then when I'm asked this question about where a torpedo would hit on North Carolina that could do the most damage, and I'm looking at the damage control diagrams, I immediately see that and go, well, I'm expecting to see that plate. I can anticipate the kind of excess damage that's going to be caused by it. I can see the evidence of it, and therefore I can point you to a theoretically worse place for the torpedo to hit, and I don't need to go back and find that out all again. Now, I obviously double check my facts, but again, because of my memory, I know where all of those bits of information came from, even though some of them were 4 or 5 years ago. So I can very quickly go, yep, I remember that right, okay, my conclusion is sound. And of course, that also means that the more research I do, the easier subsequent research usually becomes, unless I'm striking out into a brand new field, because I have all this background stuff that I still remember, which informs and helps work out what's going on with future research. And then, of course, the fact I have my library, both digital and physical, sitting around me. So obviously I do need to go to various archives or request items from archives for primary material research. But if I need to research books and some primary material that I actually physically own, if I come across a problem, like even say with a Drydock question, not this one obviously, but some other Drydock questions, like the one on that we had earlier about the Lexingtons, I can literally just reach over the back of my chair, pull out the relevant books, and again, I know roughly where the sections on the Lexingtons and the geared turbine versus turboelectric comparisons are. Quickly check, great, fantastic, move on. I don't have to plod through with an entire book or go and get one from a library. And actually, speaking of that, working on multiple streams of work at the same time helps a lot, because if I'm working on, let's say, a Wednesday video and a 5-minute guide, if I come across a bit of a break where there's something I need to research and I don't have the materials for it, I know where I can get them, but that's not available immediately, that would mean, well, now I can't do anything. Whereas if I'm working, as I do, on 3, 4, 5 Wednesday video scripts and half a dozen 5-minute guides, and occasionally looking up stuff I've noted has been asked for the Drydock, and just further reading for my own edification, it means if any one of those runs into a roadblock and I go, okay, right, I can't actually progress this until I get access to this other source, I can set things in motion to get access to that source, but then just move on to work on something else while that is going on. So I'm not losing much time, if any, overall. And again, I don't know if this is the way other people's minds work, because I'm not a telepath, but the way my mind also works is that I will have multiple streams of thought running in the background while I'm doing things. So if I know, let's say, for example, hang on, let me look at my spreadsheet. If I know, for example, that my plan is to do a video or possibly the start of a mini-series on Admiral Hawke in February 2025, well, I know I've already done some of that, but while I'm, say, doing work on the fourth instalment of Admiral Spruance's life story, which is coming in mid-January, running in the background of my mind will be going, okay, where do I need to get further resources for Admiral Hawke? And what else do I need to find about it? And how does this work with that? But also randomly, my mind will also be going, well, in January, you also want to do a bit on why invading the southeast of England is a terrible idea, which means visiting places. So have you got enough fuel in the car? And what day have you got in early January to go and do that? And make sure your drone batteries are charged and work out a driving scheme. Probably want to look that up later on. So, and so on and so on and so on. So there's a lot of other things churning around, which means that when I get around to actually, okay, now I need to physically implement this, a lot of the work has actually already been done effectively by my subconscious. And I know this has probably gone on for far too long, but I think the other thing is that I just get on with things. Now, I know that might sound a little bit stuck up possibly, but I have been asked in the past by people I know in real life, how do you get all this stuff done? Stuff I do in my personal life as well as obviously the channel. And to me, if I was going to pin it down on any one thing, it would be the attitude that my grandparents, my paternal grandmother and grandfather, raised me in, because they pretty much, brought me up in for the first 5-6 years of my life while my parents were both working, because they weren't very well off at that point. And as you might expect from a pair of people who grew up in the immediate pre-war and then World War II era, they had a very practical mindset. And one of the things that was constantly drummed into me was, if you want to do something, don't sit around worrying about all the things that could go wrong. Don't sit around prevaricating and trying to come up with reasons not to do it. If there's any risk involved, identify the risk and work out, can you mitigate it? And either if you can't, or once you've taken steps to mitigate it, is the risk acceptable? If yes, move on, right, you're doing it, and then just do it. So, and I have noticed that when I was working in the office in various companies, some people, you give them a task and they would sit there for 10, 15, 20 minutes worrying about how they're going to do the task. Whereas my general attitude would just be like, okay, this is the task. Can I do the task? Yes or no? If I can't do the task, which bits of the task can I do? And start on those. So get going on those and let your background brain processes work out how you're going to do the rest of it. So by the time you finish the bits you know you can do, you can move on to the bits that previously you didn't know you could do, or you weren't necessarily quite sure on how you could do. And you'd be amazed by actually how much time that saves in the long term, and especially when I'm working the way I am for the channel, because if Mini Drac decides that she's going to throw a tantrum about something, which means that Mrs. Drac is divided between trying to do something else, which might actually be work to alleviate the tantrum, like preparing food or whatever, and dealing with the fact the baby's kicking off, my brain just goes, okay, come to the end of whatever sentence you're doing at the moment, get up, go over there, sort out baby, crisis resolved, go back to working. It's a 5-minute disruption, but in terms of the overall household and in terms of my work, taking 5 minutes out of my work immediately then and there to deal with this crisis saves an awful lot more time than just ignoring it and letting that go on for 15, 20 minutes, half an hour, because not only does that mean other stuff isn't getting done in the house, it also means that I'm having to work with a screaming baby coming up the stairs, which obviously is going to slow down my work. So is it better for me to work full pelt for 25 minutes with a 5-minute disruption, or is it better for me to work for half an hour, 5 minutes more, but at 50% speed because I'm trying to clear a screaming baby out of my head? So sorry for a near 15-minute stream of consciousness explanation of how my brain works in the middle of a dry dock. But you did ask, so be careful what you ask for, because now thou hast most definitely received. Anyway, moving on to other questions. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, were the number of surface ship versus surface ship battles involving ships over about 500 tons more typical of the general period the channel covers in World War I or World War II? And how about all combats involving warships of any size? I think if you're looking for which of the wars has more of those combats, you're probably looking at the Second World War, partly because there's a lot more navies involved on the, if you like, the Axis side of things. So in the First World War, essentially you're looking at the Imperial German Navy, the High Seas Fleet, and the Austro-Hungarian Navy. And, well, maybe the Ottoman Navy a little bit as well. Whereas in World War II, although in terms of absolute size, the individual fleets are smaller, you're looking at the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese as the primary Axis powers. And certainly in terms of the Italians and the Japanese, they both have fairly substantial fleets. And it also spreads Allied commitment across the planet considerably more, especially obviously from December 7th, 1941 onwards. This, I think, combined with the lack of a mass battle fleet on the scale that you saw at the beginning of the First World War, means that individual ship combats are far more prevalent. Now, there were a lot of surface ship versus surface ship battles in World War I. You have things like the Harwich Force and various forays by German destroyers, lots of skirmishes in the, well, not technically the eastern end of the channel, but just beyond it, and so on and so forth. And, of course, you have various ongoing tit-for-tat stuff going on between the Regia Marina and the Austro-Hungarian Navy. But in almost all cases in World War I, there is the big overshadowing threat of mass fleet action, aka like the Battle of Jutland, or on a smaller scale in the Adriatic. And that keeps a good chunk of each side's fleet tied up in escorting the battle fleet or being the battle fleet, which means that actually there's relatively small numbers outside of those, which in turn means that, you know, there's a relatively small amount of back and forth compared to the Second World War. Whereas in the Second World War, although there is a overall numerical advantage fleet-wise in favour of the Allies, again, especially after December 7th, 1941, because of the spread-out nature and the fact that you have far fewer battleships, and apart from perhaps the Italians, they tend to be scattered. So you've got British battleships at home in the Far East, in the Mediterranean, at Force H, doing convoy escorts, etc. The Germans never have all their battleships concentrated in one place because they're either still under construction, or the Scharnhorsts are in Western France and the Bismarcks are in Germany, or later on, I suppose, what's left of them is in Norway, but that's another matter. The Japanese are spread out. You've got your carrier forces, you've got your battleships and battlecruisers. They're going after the Eastern Indian Ocean, they're going after Southeast Asia, they're going after the Western Pacific, and obviously the Allies are moving to counter all of that. And then when the Allies are on the offensive, the Axis powers are trying to counter them. But when you've got lots of individual units, and then you have subunits like Force K, which doesn't have any capital ships, Mediterranean convoys being escorted by Italian surface ships, and Allied efforts to attack them, Allied convoys being escorted by surface ships, and Italian efforts to attack them, German blockade runners coming into Western France and Allied efforts to disrupt those, and so on and so on and so on and so forth. It means that there's a lot more individual actions between either single ships or small groups of ships, because the big threat of an overwhelming fleet coming over the horizon to flatten one side or the other, should the situation go slightly skew-if, just isn't there. You know, if you've got destroyers and cruisers on the Allied side and destroyers and torpedo boats on the German side duking it out over whether or not a blockade runner is going to get into Western France, well, for most of the time there aren't any German battleships there, and when they are, they're under bombardment in Brest, so they're not going to come out and help. There's no Allied battleships in the immediate vicinity either. The nearest ones are probably either in Force H or out on a convoy, and they're not coming for a while. And that actually, I think, in World War II gives a lot more freedom for people to risk destroyer and cruiser actions, and thus you get a large increase in them. Plus, of course, you have the sort of various small craft wars, especially in the English Channel and the southern North Sea, between MTBs and MGBs versus the Schnellbooter, and to a lesser extent some Schnellboote, but also Mars boats versus MTBs and MGBs and so forth in the Mediterranean, although that's not quite as intense as it is in the Channel. Marlin Stout asks, there is very excellent content, both on this channel and others, on how the use of radar, sonar, and the Western Approaches Tactical Unit affected the development of anti-submarine tactics, and how an escort attacked a detected U-boat in World War II. Could you please discuss how anti-submarine strategy developed in World War I and World War II respectively? For example, much has been made of the importance of Enigma decoding, but how do other intelligence methods like traffic analysis and HFDF compare in importance? Well, overall, that's really, a Wednesday video or a series of Wednesday videos, but in brief, anti-submarine strategy developed, I would say, a lot faster in World War II, albeit that, very technically speaking, the jump in overall capability is more in World War I, purely because at the beginning of World War I, the only real anti-submarine strategy was if submarine surfaces in visual range, shoot it with guns, or maybe ram it, because there just wasn't any other counter to submarines. Depth charges didn't exist, ASDIC-sonar didn't exist, so you couldn't hurt something that was underwater unless you accidentally rammed it, and that was pretty much it. And of course they had to very rapidly evolve that from we can't hurt them to various slightly esoteric methods that really wouldn't have worked very well, like the whole row over to a periscope with a rowboat and get a man with a hammer to smash the glass on the periscope lens, all the way through to the development of the first depth charges. And then once you develop the depth charges, well, what ships should you use to deploy said depth charges? And at that point, a lot of it, because obviously there aren't dedicated anti-submarine escorts, is how do we develop a dedicated anti-submarine escort? But that only really comes in towards the end of the war. But also, how do we adapt existing ships to the anti-submarine escort role, like the first generation Flower class sloops of the First World War, and so on and so forth. I would argue, therefore, in some ways, not only was the actual jumping capability greater, but perhaps also some of the ideas were a little bit more advanced than you see in World War II, because one of the things you see, for example, is the R-class submarine in the Royal Navy. A hunter-killer submarine, 3-4 decades too early in some ways? You don't really see anyone trying to develop a true hunter-killer sub for the majority of World War II. But you go from not having a submarine fighting strategy to, hey, this thing is designed specifically to move at high speeds underwater, track down using hydrophones, aka passive sonar, and then shotgun torpedoes at an underwater target. And that happens in 3 years, if that, in the First World War. Whereas in the Second World War, you come off of an interwar period where obviously depth charges have been sorted out. Everyone knows roughly what their capabilities should be. There is now the idea of a dedicated anti-submarine escort ship, which some navies even have under construction or a few in service. And there's been interwar exercises dealing with subs, but you do have a little bit of a crutch in that for the countries that do actually have it, ASDIC or sonar is seen as kind of the solved issue. So the Royal Navy, while they appreciate the need to apply depth charge to submarine, they think that ASDIC is basically going to allow them to do that fairly easily, whereas it turns out that that's a slightly overblown claim, and you end up obviously then having to develop and iterate lots of tactics. But in World War II, you start off from a basis of convoys with anti-submarine escorts, with depth charges, and ASDIC, so passive and active sonar, and an awful lot of what then goes on is attempts to improve how to use that technology to apply depth charge to submarine, and the submarine's attempts to counter that, which is a lot more complex and advances very rapidly, but ultimately is aiming at exactly the same outcome. And then obviously right at the end of the war you get things like homing torpedoes and such, like, which change things up a little bit. But when it comes into stuff outside of that more immediate issue, so Enigma decoding, traffic analysis, HFDF, etc., it's all layered into each other. So it's very difficult to pick apart and say this one was particularly more important than the other, because Enigma decoding you can't always use without giving away the fact you have actually decoded Enigma, but something like Enigma decoding might allow you to avoid a conflict entirely simply by slightly redirecting a convoy to sail north or south of a wolf pack, so there is no engagement. But in times when you can't do that for whatever reason, then it at least gives you notice, so your escorts know, okay, there is a wolf pack, it's roughly this many U-boats, they're roughly 300 miles ahead of you, so in X days' time you can expect to be attacked. Now, that doesn't stop the Germans attacking, and it doesn't avoid them attacking, but it does give everyone a heads up so they're ready for it. And that's where other things like HFDF come in, because HFDF, in theory, even without Enigma, would allow you to say, there is a U-boat out there. But with Enigma decoding, you can go, okay, we know that there's a U-boat out there. We know there's 10 U-boats out there. So we're going to listen at this time when we know we're in the vicinity. And then when you hear the signals, okay, so we know there's a U-boat there. We know there's one there, compared to this analysis of how many there and where there should be. So they're probably here, here, and here. So we either go out and attack them, or we bunker down, depending on how many escorts and how many U-boats we think there are. Whereas without Enigma, it would be a case of, there's a submarine out there. We should probably go off and attack it. But if there's a whole wolf pack out there and only one of them has signaled, now you've left the convoy exposed. Or, you're just surprised that there's a submarine and then there's 2, 3, 4 all signaling. Oh no, how many are there? Well, we've detected 4, but is it just 4 that are signaling and because there are 4? Is it 4 that they're signaling because they're each the leaders of a wolf pack and there's 48 out there? Who knows? So HFDF definitely helps give you a vector and decide, is that important? What do you do about it? But it meshes with the Enigma information to produce an outcome that's greater than the whole. And the same with traffic analysis, the same with all this other stuff. So pull any one of those out and the whole system would come crashing down and you'd have to adapt the system. But equally, they are so interleaved that trying to say, well, this one is the most important, this is second most, this is third most, this is fourth most, is incredibly difficult. And I think you ask 10 historians, you'll get 10 different answers. Red Ranger asks, a number of channels on YouTube that do React content have started to notice your videos, including more than a few ex-Navy personnel which have universally given you high praise. What are your feelings in general about said React content, assuming they follow common courtesies such as linking to the original video, waiting a reasonable amount of time before reacting, and adding their own thoughts and commentary rather than just sitting there and blinking, etc.? I have mixed feelings on reaction content. And that's because I tend to divide reaction content into 4 broad categories, and my opinions on each of them are quite varied. So, of course, you have the people who don't follow the common courtesies, like linking to the original video. They try and react within 24 hours, or they just sit there going, And those I hate. They don't really deserve to exist, in my opinion. And if I found someone who was doing, let's say, a reaction to Drax videos and their entire thing was just to sit there with it playing in the top left corner, just going, or blinking or whatever, I would just go, okay, that's just, you're just essentially reposting my video, at which point I would just claim it. Go, okay, well, you want to play that game? Let's see if 2 can play that game. Then if you like, one step up is people who actually do try and add their own thoughts and commentary, but either are going in there with a very specific agenda and therefore are not being objective. And I tend to rank those people in with other people who basically just don't actually know what they're talking about. And in both cases, they will usually claim to have done their research, but what usually happens is that they've either done a very shallow level of research, as in, I watched this other YouTube video, or I read one book and that has defined how I think of it forever, or I read on Reddit, which is not a source, spoiler alert, I read this angry set of 2 or 3 people on Reddit who said all the horrible things about Drac and or his videos, and therefore I'm going to just believe them and claim. It's just really stupid. I mean, slight tangent, but I avoid Reddit generally. It's one of the best ways to maintain your mental health. But at one point, someone directed me to a thread where there was this extremely long polemic that someone had written about a video I'd done where they were claiming, Drac hasn't done any research, he's made this all up, it's all a bunch of nonsense, it's, if it's anything, it's based on a handful of web forum postings. I don't know where exactly anyone would do enough web forum posting to generate a 30 or 40-minute video, but there you go. Except maybe this polemic, this thing might have taken 20 minutes to read. But then at the end of it, someone else chimed in and said, well, actually, most of this random ad hominem gibberish aside, Drac later actually held a giveaway where he gave away a bunch of the books he used as sources for this video, and I happened to have one of them, and I read it through, and what Drac said in the video matches up with what the book says, and the book has a bunch of bibliography information. It shows where it got its information from, so Drac didn't make it up. If Drac's video is wrong, then this book and all of its sources are also wrong, which I think shut the original poster up because they didn't make any particular response to that. But it just shows you that just because someone can write an awful lot on Reddit doesn't mean they actually know a single thing about what they're talking about. And some reaction content just generally seems to be, I found this thing on the internet that says this, therefore I'm going to try and make a quick buck off of YouTube by loudly proclaiming this other thing on the internet as the gospel truth, rather than in opposition to something that was actually researched. And you'll see similar things with people with agendas. They desperately either want to prove something wrong or they want to big up something, and they will just find very selective evidence for that thing and attack absolutely anybody who says anything even mildly contradictory. So, unsurprisingly, I don't particularly have a lot of time for those reaction channels either, because, well, they might be contributing their own thoughts and commentary, but those thoughts and commentary probably weren't worth the oxygen it took to, form the neural pathways to actually speak those words. But then you have 2 other kinds of reaction content, and these 2 I actually think are fairly worthwhile. Now, one type is someone who will admit generally that they don't necessarily know a huge amount about a subject in question, but there is perhaps a common narrative that is told about that subject in, the general populace or among their sort of local think group. And then they find a video that says something very different and, either cites directly within the video or in the video description, specific sources with evidence to show why this contrary opinion is the case. And they'll react and they'll say, well, okay, you know what? I didn't know that. People say this, but actually, the evidence seems to show that actually this is the case instead. That's very interesting. So they're people who are coming, as I said, from a position where they don't necessarily know a huge amount about the topic in question, but they are essentially publicizing and highlighting the difference between someone who actually has looked at what the evidence is and what people might be trying to push for whatever political reason. I've seen 1 or 2 people in passing who've done reaction videos, I think, to the West Africa Squadron Anti-Slavery Patrol video that I did way back. I need to do a much more expanded West Africa Squadron and Royal Navy anti-slavery video at some point, perhaps next year. But the couple that I did see were essentially, going, well, the current narrative in pretty much what Twitter and Reddit says this about slavery and Britain's involvement in it, whereas, this is showing another side to things. So, and this is interesting. So, okay, yeah, I think that's valid. It's a compare and contrast, essentially, which is a perfectly fine thing to do. And then the final kind of reaction content is something which you actually alluded to in your question, which is where you have people who actually genuinely do know what they're talking about and they want to provide their own thoughts and commentary on what has been said. So people who are, actual naval historians or have either served in a navy or are currently serving in a navy, people who will actually understand what is being said. And at that point, yes, they might have different ideas or they might disagree with something. That's fine. That's what happens in historical circles amongst historians. If there was a single monolithic historical narrative, everything would be very boring. There's a lot of discussion. Some people outright disagree. Other times there's disagreement about how to interpret a source or how to interpret events. But there is also a lot of agreement. So, these people might also agree with what's being said. Or, of course, you might also have a third thing, which is that within the videos that I do, obviously there is a limited amount of time, because even if you look at one or two of the books, which I'll cite in the video descriptions, if I was to read you the entire relevant sections of that book, and that book alone, let alone any other books, primary source material, etc., it would be far more content than just half an hour to an hour. So I am condensing down information, and depending on the complexity of the subject, perhaps also sometimes simplifying it. But for example, someone who's been in naval service might have personal anecdotes about what exactly it was like to experience that thing. So for example, perhaps talking about naval gunnery, I can tell you how naval gunnery works, but someone might actually have served aboard, let's say, one of the Iowa class in the 1980s when they were actively firing their guns. And they can tell you exactly what it was like to actually be in the turrets or to be watching the guns firing, which is something that I can't do because I wasn't there. So when they add that kind of personal experience, or in the case of an academic expertise, that is also very valuable. Or they might just use it to expand on a point, because I, to a certain extent, am summarizing a lot of information. I might mention something in passing, maybe a 30-second section of the video, but that might be an aspect of technology or an aspect of a person or a particular incident, which the person who's doing the reaction content might have a lot more interest in. And because, well, it's their content, they might just be, reacting to a few sections of a video, but then they'll go, okay, well, Drax said this in passing, but let me tell you about this person in a lot more detail. So, for example, let's say the Battle of Samar. So obviously I mention Captain Evans of USS Johnston, and he gets mentioned a few times, but someone who's done an awful lot more research into Johnston and Captain Evans specifically might then choose to do a reaction, because it's the Battle of Samar, that's kind of his shining hour, and just pick out the points where Evans was mentioned, and then pause and then do like a 10-15 minute section on, well, this is the backstory of Captain Evans, this is how he got into the US Navy, why it was important for him to get into the US Navy in particular, because you still had segregation in the Navy, and he was not a 100% white person, which was an issue in the Navy at the time, and all sorts of things like this. So that kind of content, where you're either getting an alternate point of view or an expanded point of view from someone who knows what they're talking about, either through having actually done the research or through having actually lived part of it, that is completely valid and actually very valuable. So assuming that in the latter two category cases they are actually following the common courtesies you mentioned, then I have no problem with that. Silder and Machine Works asks, I have a question on the sizing of naval guns in either inch or metric measurements. Obviously the US and the UK would use inch sizes like 4.5, 12, 13.5 inch, etc. Countries that use the metric system sometimes use round metric sizes like 105 or 150 millimeter, but would often use designations that closely match nominal inch sizes like 152 millimeter or 203 millimeter, 6 and 8 inch respectively. With a few exceptions, battleship main guns all seem to be nominal inch sizes, even from metric countries. Was this because of British domination of naval technology, or some other reason? There's a mixture of factors involved, but a good chunk of it is British domination of naval technology, because once you start to see a wide variety of guns deployed on warships, i.e. basically the mid-pre-Dreadnought period and onwards, At that stage, Britain is still by far the predominant naval power and is exporting guns left, right and centre to anyone who really will buy them, which means that a lot of other nations will have guns in inch measurements, regardless of whether they use imperial or metric measurements, simply because they're buying the guns from the British. And if they are a big enough nation that they're then developing their own gun-making technology based off of either guns or gun-making tech that has been brought over from the UK, or latterly sometimes the US, then they are going to tend to extrapolate based on what they have inherited. The Japanese in particular being an example of this. Japanese generally worked in metric, but their guns and gun technology was pretty much almost entirely for pre-Dreadnought and Dreadnought era based off of British technology. So unsurprisingly, initially, they're buying in 12-inch and 14-inch guns, so they're going to be 12 and 14-inch regardless. And then when they're moving on to building their own, well, they're probably going to stick with the point they started at. And the reason that's important is because, as I've mentioned a few other times, when you are evolving gun calibers, let's say from 14-inch to 16-inch or so on, a lot of the time there is your sweet spot that you're starting out with, and then there's an area a little bit beyond that which you don't really want to go into, because you will be increasing the size slightly, but of course because of the square cube law, you'll be increasing the weight of your gun and your shells and so forth substantially more, without getting all that much more in terms of actual hitting power or range or whatever it is you're looking for. And then as you draw further and further on, while admittedly, obviously, your size and weight issues are going up and up and up, eventually you'll reach a point where the increase in performance actually justifies the additional weight. And that's just a matter of physics. It doesn't matter whether you're measuring that in feet and inches or meters and centimeters. And so, for example, they move from a 14-inch to a 16-inch gun, or approximate equivalence thereof, is pretty much going to be a universal constant in, let's say, the late 1910s, early 1920s. You'll also have certain physical issues. There'll be certain shell weights that people, if you're looking at a manual or semi-manual handling system, physically cannot go beyond if you want regular fast firing. And that's why secondary batteries and dual-purpose batteries, regardless of the nation, they all tend to hover at roughly a similar area, especially when you're talking about largely manually loaded systems. You end up with 4, 4.5, 4.7, 5-inch or near equivalents in metric, but it's all limited by human physicality, which with a few exceptions is fairly consistent across the board. And likewise with further technologies like quick firing or auto loading, if generally this technology has been advanced to work on a gun of up to a certain caliber, well, everyone is going to go up to that caliber, and they can't go further because the technology doesn't exist to allow you to take that particular way of working further. If you're looking at the interwar period, there is a little bit more of a restriction because, of course, you have upper limits set by naval treaties, and no one wants to be particularly smaller than anybody else in terms of gun caliber. And so if the treaty says, well, you can build cruisers with up to 6-inch or 155mm guns, or 8-inch or 203mm guns, or 14-inch, etc., 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 well, everyone's going to build to that. Yes, it might make sense from a neatness perspective to build to 200mm, but then your guns are now 3mm smaller than the other guy's guns, and that can't possibly stand. But there's also a certain practicality to it, because if somebody has built a ship that's got a certain type of armament and a certain type of armor and other performance and etc., if you want to match that capability without either igniting an arms race in an era without treaties, or just from a pure cost effectiveness perspective, it's best to sort of mirror match. Obviously, you're not going to exactly mirror match because your technology base and your tactics and strategy and requirements might be slightly different to the other guys. But broadly speaking, if someone goes, well, we've got a quick-firing 6-inch gun, we're going to equip it with it onto our cruisers, or as the secondary armament on our battleships, because we think we need this to knock out enemy destroyers, well, you've probably got similar requirements, and if that technology from this other navy has been proven to work, well, adopt something that's roughly the equivalent thereof or close to. In some ways, you're kind of piggybacking on the research that whoever first adopted that gun caliber has already done, because presumably, if they wanted a lighter weight gun, then they would have made one, but there's presumably reasons why they haven't adopted that, and presumably there's also reasons why they haven't adopted a larger gun. And some of those will be fairly obvious to you anyway, but if somebody's already decided, hey, the sweet spot is 6-inch or 8-inch or whatever, well, copying that as close to as you can means that you presumably will inherit most of the benefits and very few of the drawbacks without having to do a whole load of expensive research and testing yourself. And up until the end of World War I, when you're still looking at an export market, the other thing is, of course, if you do deviate significantly from what everybody else is doing, that might affect your overseas sales potential, because you might say, oh, well, I think I want a 6-inch gun for my secondary battery, and someone else goes, oh, yes, well, I don't like that, so I'm going to do a 140mm gun, for example. Okay, that's fine, great for them, but then if you're then trying to sell, let's say, small cruisers to a South American Navy, and they're looking at the cards and they're going to go, well, 6-inch, well, we work in metric, so 152mm or 140mm, or 152mm is bigger, it's going to hit harder, it's going to go further, unless one side or the other has a dramatic technological advantage, so we're going to go with that one. So if you do want to actually export your guns, then probably don't massively deviate from what other people are offering. Otherwise, they'll either escalate to meet you, or they'll just laugh as everybody ignores you and buys their bigger guns. Texas and LaShock asks, on the recent Battleship New Jersey video where Ryan was going over some documents they just discovered, I found the part where someone in documentation brought up the possibility of installing an Aegis system on it, and someone else emphatically responding, no, also in documentation, rather amusing. In any documentation you've seen, have you encountered any other such humorous discussions? Yeah, there's a few. When you look into enough primary source documents, you will come across them here and there. I mean, when you look at the documentation surrounding the development of the G3 class battle cruisers, rather famously, in some circles at least, there's a note where looking at the projected top speed of the G3s versus the actual horsepower of the G3s, which is actually something that people will sometimes bring up and argue that they're unrealistic, because the G3s appear to have far too little shaft horsepower for the speed they want to go at. There's this whole back and forth in the documentation about whether or not this will actually work, and essentially one side of the argument is we've done an awful lot of Froude tank testing with the hull form, and we've heavily optimized the hull to be really efficient for speed. A lot of work of that which work would then go into the development of Nelson and Rodney, which explains a few things about them. But at the end of it, it kind of concludes with this little, essentially, literally a bet. There's a bet between two of the major ship designers and constructors, and essentially goes, well, if the ship actually makes its design speed, I'll pay you, I think it's £1, and if it doesn't, you owe me a £5. Of course, reading anything that's written by Admiral Fisher is always amusing because of the bombastic quality of most of his writings. There's capitalization, all caps, multiple explanation points, red underlining and circling all over the place. There was one proposal that didn't seem to really get very far off the drawing board, to stick ICBMs in the unused barbettes, or once you remove the turrets at least, to be unused barbettes, on the aft end of county-class cruisers. This is in the early Cold War period. And there's some rather colourful responses in the margins to that sketch proposal. There's one sketch for a destroyer that I've come across, well, discussion about an outline plan for a destroyer. It was a class that was eventually built, but the final design is absolutely nothing like the design that's under discussion in this part of the correspondence. And well, I'll let you speculate as to exactly which navy this was for, but the idea would have had the destroyer launch with 2 extra deck guns and, if I'm recalling correctly, at least 3 extra torpedo tubes compared to what it historically launched with. And somebody replied, and I think the funniest thing about this reply is that the actual reply is incredibly short. The rest of it, because bearing in mind this is all manually typed up at the time, so you've got from whoever the person who's sending it to date, time, department, signature, title, date. So, all this formality that takes up about a third of a page, and the response is literally just words to the effect of, "I do not want to command a submarine." Signed. Although the one that had me laughing the most was a proposal for, if I'm remembering this correctly, because this was about 3 or 4 years ago, this was a proposal for what would eventually become the battle class destroyers. Dr. Clark has done a lot more work into that particular class, can probably tell you exactly which set of papers it's in. But it's not really a serious discussion, but essentially what happened was somebody slightly mistyped when they were sending this correspondence, and instead of saying that they wanted about 50,000 shaft horsepower for the class, they hit one too many zeros, and it was correspondence asking about the possibility of changing the power plant of the battle class to 500,000 shaft horsepower. And this has been basically just noted and returned. But in the margin, next to the bit which says 500,000 SHP, someone's drawn a little destroyer just with its stern in the water and the rest of the ship pointing up at 45 degrees in the air, with a long stream of smoke coming out the back, and a little set of characters. It's all done in very, very tiny script, but I think it says something just like, "Whee!" This is hydroplaning destroyer jetting off into the distance. Lord Druken asks, "It seems to be rather popular among armchair historians to pit the US Iowa-class battleships up against the battleships of the various Axis powers, particularly the Yamatos and Bismarck. The Yamatos make some sense, as the ships are commissioned prior to and saw service around the time when the Iowas were commissioned, but pitting them against the German and Italian battleships seems rather odd to me, since most of those had been pretty much neutralised through various means by the time the Iowas entered service. Are these matchups popular among people simply because of the longevity of the Iowas after World War II, or are there other reasons why they overshadow the other American battleships, particularly the North Carolinas and South Dakotas?" I would say there's probably 3 reasons when you're looking specifically at armchair historians, as you said in your question, with varying degrees of charitability involved. So yes, I think one reason is that the Iowas are much more in the public consciousness than the North Carolinas and South Dakotas. There's 4 of them still around as the whole class. Now, there are 3 of the others around, but there's obviously only 1 of the North Carolinas, North Carolina herself, and then Massachusetts and Alabama, the 2 South Dakotas. So in terms of both, they were around in the 80s and early 90s, which is still within living memory of a reasonable chunk of the population in active service, and they actually make up the majority of preserved fast battleships, and at least in the States, they are the single largest represented class of museum battleships. Then obviously that is going to factor into people going, "Oh, well, I know this battleship, how would it have squared up against all these others?" Another way of looking at things, which is still mildly charitable, is, well, the Iowas were the latest and greatest American battleship. They're the biggest ones the Americans ever actually built, so why don't we compare them to the biggest and best that everybody else actually built? And, well, if other people couldn't build something as big and as heavily armed as the Iowa class, well, sucks to be them. They should have tried harder. Lol, lol, lol. So, that's somewhat charitable, but not as charitable as the first reason, at least in terms of me advocating for it. But you can, to a certain degree, understand the at least from a very armchair historian basic level, of, well, the Iowas are the biggest and best American ships, so Bismarck, Littorio, Yamato, King George V, maybe Vanguard, are the biggest and best of the other navies, so let's all compare them. Because, I mean, yes, it ignores an awful lot of things like when they were built and so forth, but it's understandable at a basic level. And the other reason, which might be for some people, and is somewhat less charitable, is they just want to win. And ultimately, the Iowas are some of the most lethal war machines ever created in terms of battleships, and so if they want, quote-unquote, their side to win, well, pick an Iowa, and there's not going to be all that many ships that come close to an Iowa, which then makes it somewhat easier for their egos to go out and say, well, let's put an Iowa up against this, it wins, an Iowa against this, it wins, an Iowa against this, it wins. And, ultimately, unless you do put an Iowa up against something like Yamato for firepower and sheer level of protection, and possibly Vanguard in terms of fire control accuracy and hitting first, well, almost anything else is going to come off pretty poor. So if you're looking for an answer in the first place, you've pre-reached your conclusion of, I want Iowa to win, or I'm American, I want America to win, well, pick an Iowa. You usually will. And even against the absolute best that can be thrown against you in terms of ships that were actually built, like Vanguard or Yamato, it's still going to be very close. Whereas if you pick a North Carolina or South Dakota, there's a possibility you might come across a few ships that are either competitive or perhaps better, and some people just can't stand their side to lose. I mean, as I said, that's the third reason. It's relatively uncharitable, but it definitely is in play with a few people. Brad in SoCal asks, in the book Ships of Oak, Guns of Iron, they mention that the US had 900 or so privateers compared to a dozen or so actual full-scale warships. They then suggest that privateers had no real effect on the blockade during the War of 1812. What is your view on the ability of privateers as a response to blockade actions? Well, I think there's two streams of thought there. So, can privateers in and of themselves do something about a blockade? No, they really, really can't, because privateers are, of course, privately equipped warships, and by the time of the War of 1812, even the absolute best trained and best equipped privately equipped warship is maybe a match for a sloop or schooner in actual naval service, because they just simply aren't going to have the firepower or the size or the crew numbers to match an actual rated ship, whether that be a fifth rate, sixth rate, fourth rate, whatever. So privateers cannot really affect a navy that shows up with actual rated ships and sits off your ports and goes, hey, we're blockading you. Yes, you can mitigate the effect of the blockade slightly by capturing ships and sending them into either ports that aren't being blockaded or sneaking them past the blockaders, which obviously brings in supplies and money, which the blockade would otherwise have cut off. But fundamentally, a bunch of privateers are not going to actually stop the blockade from happening. But in terms of a response to a blockade, as in the blockade has locked most of our valuable warships in, but we can surge a bunch of small, relatively lightly armed privateers out to do something to the opposition, on the basis they can't catch everybody. It's a response, but what the scale of the effect it's going to have depends partly on how many privateers do you have, relative to how many ships does the opponent have, how successful are they, and what are they successful against? Because, of course, a warship, even a frigate, even a small frigate, will usually be able to take on pretty much any merchant ship it comes across. So you could have an East Indiaman full of, enough cargo to represent a double-digit percentage of, in the War of 1812's case, the USA's annual GDP, and a cruising rated frigate of the US Navy would be able to take that ship, and that would be a huge economic impact to the UK and an even bigger economic impact when the thing arrives in the US. I mean, it's not quite Drake showing up with the Golden Hind levels, but could still be fairly substantial. But your average privateer confronted by a big, heavily armed East Indiaman is best advised to steer away, because that East Indiaman will turn them into a colander. So it's not just, oh yes, I've captured a dozen ships. Well, yeah, if you've captured a dozen, 200-300 ton small merchant ships, that's good on paper, but probably doesn't actually represent all that much of an economic impact. Whereas one warship capturing or burning one particularly large merchant vessel might have the same economic impact as 24 privateers, all being out and about for months. And then, of course, you have to factor in not only how successful a privateer is at capturing enemy ships, but how successful are they at holding on to them. Because if you capture a bunch of enemy ships, but then the enemy recaptures a significant portion of them, and perhaps takes a good chunk out of your privateering force as well, then not only will the net impact back home perhaps not be all that great, because you've got a certain percentage of captured ships coming in, but you're having to offset in broader terms that economic gain versus the economic loss of however many privateers are being captured. And then you've also got to look at the net effect on your opponent, because, again, using the War of 1812, 900 or so privateers, that's admittedly a lot of ships. But if your 900 or so privateers only manage to capture a few percentage points of the overall enemy merchant marine, is then, in the context of it's peacetime, but suddenly 2-3% of our merchant fleet has been captured, that's a disaster. But in 1812, 1813, 1814, when you've been fighting when the UK has been fighting the French for probably better part of 2 decades, not almost non-stop at that point, and French warships and French privateers, both of which are present in much greater numbers, as well as Spanish and so on and so forth, everyone else that Britain had fought up in those 2 decades, has been taking a significantly greater portion of the merchant fleet, and obviously some of them being recaptured, and various warships and privateers being captured and destroyed and so forth, then the overall impact on the enemy, even if they're very successful at capturing ships, is probably not going to be all that much. It's a bee sting on an elephant kind of situation. So, in general, using large numbers of privateers as a response to an economic blockade can, in some circumstances, work, but it very much depends on who you are and who your enemy is and what circumstances you were both in prior to the war. In particular relation to the War of 1812, I edge more towards that, yes, privateers did have an effect on the war, but broadly speaking, that effect was relatively negligible in overall terms, given the situation and circumstances of who the enemy, i.e. the British Empire, was, and what circumstances they've been in up to that point. Because yes, the Napoleonic Wars did have a pause towards the end of the War of 1812, and to be honest, the lack of French and other hostile naval activity in the Napoleonic Wars had a far, 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 far greater effect on the British Merchant Marine and the Royal Navy's operations than the actions of any arbitrary number of US privateers. Sapper Ninja asks, if the Queen Elizabeths had been completed with small tube boilers and were thus capable of 26 to 27 knots, does this change what the treaties would agree to or allow? If these ships were to create an earlier butterfly, like something at Jutland fundamentally changes, then please include this in your answer. Well, I think there might be a slight earlier butterfly, in as much as if the Queen Elizabeths are actually capable of doing, let's say, 27 knots, and Jellicoe thought they might even do 28, then regardless of how terrible BT and Seymour signalling is, the margin of extra speed that they have means that they will catch up in the run to the south somewhat earlier, which means that the poor old first scouting group is going to be under accurate 15-inch gunfire for considerably longer, And of course, when it comes time to turn away from the high seas fleet, they're going to get out of range a lot sooner, which means they'll probably take a little bit less damage. Now, net, that's probably not going to affect the overall outcome of Jutland all that much, but it is going to lead to the first scouting group taking considerably heavier casualties and possibly one or two more losses. It might be enough damage to tip Seydlitz over the edge from extremely badly damaged to actually sinking in the open sea, for example. And it might, and I stress might, preserve maybe Queen Mary. It depends on when they exactly arrive. Now, as I said, they're probably not going to change Jutland generally, except that there'll be a couple more kill tallies for the British versus the Germans. But what it would show is that you can build a battleship that is capable of running down and destroying battlecruisers, at least battlecruisers that are a few years its inferior. That, in turn, might prompt people to start looking at the idea of faster capital ships a little bit earlier. The effects on the treaties, though, I think would not be that great, because for Japan, they're already building slightly faster than average capital ships, and it's Jutland would be a little bit too late for them to change anything on the Iseis. And for the Nagatos, they're already building them somewhat faster already. So I don't think that's going to fundamentally change how the Japanese see the Nagatos. Where it could see a slight change, however, is for the Americans. Probably, again, maybe a little bit too late to fundamentally cause a complete redesign of the New Mexicos, but perhaps the Tennessees and the Colorados might be designed with, even if not necessarily matching the Queen Elizabeth, which at that point might be classed as almost a big battle cruiser rather than a fast battleship, but they might actually look at increasing the speed of the Tennessees and the Colorados somewhat, perhaps to 23 or 24 knots, maybe a little bit more. Now, that might cost them some armament, or it might cost them some protection, or they might just be bigger. It might persuade the US to actually give the US Navy more than $2 and a dime for its annual budget. So they might be going into the Washington Treaty with a slightly different fleet. But ultimately, the Revenge class are still supposed to be the true slow, if you like, battleship, cheaper equivalent, so it's not going to affect them. The British don't build any other battleships in the interim, only battlecruisers. And although, again, it might affect how the British want to do things at the treaty, so they might, in the case of high-speed Queen Elizabeths proving their worth, they might go for perhaps a slightly more protected version of F3. So bear in mind, F3's projected speed was 29 knots. So they might go, okay, F3 will accept 27 knots or 28 knots to match the Queen Elizabeth, and with that slight reduction in machinery, we'll stick a little bit more armour on it instead of the historic Nelson and Rodney. But ultimately, these ships are still under 35,000 tons, so 35,000 tons and 16-inch guns will probably still be what the Washington Naval Treaty settles on, unless someone decides that they want to retain the Colorado's proposed armament and protection, but they want to hit, let's say, 25 knots, and they want to retain the heavy turboelectric drive. All of that in combination might push their displacement over 35,000 tons, in which case the Americans won't want to have to scrap them, or at least most of them, which means that although 16-inch guns will probably still be the armament upper limit in the treaty, the displacement limit might well be whatever the Colorados end up being plus a little bit. So let's say they come out at 36,300 tons arbitrarily, which would be about 4,000 tons more than they are historically, then they might set the limit at 37 or 37,500. Adam Schindler asks, in your opinion, did improved fire control or the requirement for improved lethality drive the increase in anti-aircraft caliber for the US Navy during the Pacific War? Or alternately, Is improved fire control just the limiting factor on an evolution of, yes, of course I want to hit the biggest, deadliest shell that I can hit with? I don't think it's fire control so much as the lethality index that it's driving the increase in anti-aircraft caliber, because fundamentally, even with late war era fire control, the speed of aircraft and their ability to maneuver means that you're not going to go one shot, one kill. You're still going to have to fill the air with a bunch of proximity fused shells, using the larger guns, or just shells with the smaller guns. And the fire control is more about putting the shells in roughly the area where they might cause some damage, but you still need volume of fire. And this is pretty much appreciated, and of course that means that, at least in theory, the larger the number of shells you can put out, the more lethal you will be, and that predicates towards smaller guns, like, say, a 20mm Oerlikon. You do need your big, heavy dual-purpose stuff for long-range firepower, disrupting formations, etc., etc., but in terms of your general, by most barrel count AA armament, you, just by that paradigm, want numerous smaller guns because there's just a lot more shells in the air. What drives the increase in caliber, I don't think is so much the destructive power of a 40mm versus a 20mm shell, or a 3-inch versus a 40mm towards the end of the war, although that is something of a factor, because a 40mm, generally speaking, will cripple at least an aircraft with a good direct hit. A 20mm, you probably need a few hits, unless you get lucky. And a 3-inch obviously will obliterate almost anything that's not multiple engines. But the main reason for that increase is more to do with the effective engagement range, which in turn is to do with where the enemy is capable of dropping their bombs or torpedoes. Because in the early part of the war, you either have to fly low, slow, and close to drop a torpedo, or you're coming in over the enemy deck almost or near enough and releasing bombs at a relatively low altitude for accurate dive bombing. In those terms, a 20mm Oerlikon is more than sufficient. The problem is that as enemies learn that you can actually drop your bombs from a dive bomber at higher altitudes, or in the case of some of the armor-piercing bombs, you have to drop them from higher altitudes, and torpedo bombers become progressively more and more capable of dropping torpedoes at longer distances and higher speeds, you have two factors. Firstly, some enemy aircraft are able to just release their weapons outside of the distance, the effective distance, this is not the absolute distance, of a 20mm Oerlikon, and then just pull away so they can't be engaged. Or they might still be able to be engaged, but they're engaged after they've dropped their weapon, which means at best you get a mutual kill. Well, that's worst case scenario for both sides, actually, but at best you'll shoot something down, but the weapon is still coming in. Whereas a Bofors allows you to reach out further. So with a Bofors, you now can engage these better enemy aircraft before they've dropped their weapons, which is a plus point. But then towards the end of the war, you've started to get rockets, missiles, guided weapons, etc., etc., and suddenly the engagement distance has jumped again, because now these weapons are putting the 40mm Bofors in a similar position to what the 20mm Oerlikon was being put in a few years before. And so you need now to again be able to reach out and hit the enemy before their weapons release point, which leads to the adoption of the 3-inch automatic. The 40mm is still there in a lot of cases, but it's a backstop weapon in the way that the 20mm was a backstop to the 40mm. And then later on, as surface-to-air missiles are developed in the Cold War, as again weapons release ranges become longer and longer, then the surface-to-air missiles are the primary defense, and the 3-inch is the backstop. And then nowadays, obviously, you have longer range surface-to-air missiles, and with shorter range surface-to-air missiles as a backstop, or perhaps a CIWS or something. Of course, with every increase in caliber, you can have fewer and fewer guns aboard, which means less individual opportunities to shoot down an enemy aircraft per second, and so really the caliber increase is only going to be driven by the necessity to have those larger weapons, because ideally speaking you want to hit the enemy before they've released a weapon that can hit you. ACC asks, if a Dreadnought is a warship with, roughly speaking, the best armour and power plant available to a navy, and, roughly speaking, the biggest guns available in an all-centerline-turret configuration with limited secondary battery, then doesn't that technically make Monitor the first Dreadnought? And in the event the answer is no, are there any design lines that carry through the interim, or are these surface comparisons just an example of convergent evolution? I mean, by that very specific and narrow definition, you could make an argument that Monitor is a Dreadnought, but more realistically, the specifications, or at least the bare specifications of what makes a Dreadnought, include a few things that Monitor doesn't possess, like, well, ocean-going capability, for one thing, and also the reason for putting the biggest guns available in an all-centerline turret configuration, albeit even Dreadnought didn't have all centerline, she had wing turrets, but the main reason for the all-big gun armament was to facilitate long-distance fire to outrange the enemy, whereas with Monitor, well, engagement ranges on Monitor were pretty close range. To be fair, even though she had big guns, she probably could actually come under accurate fire from other ships before she herself could engage, because of the limitations of the design. Now, between Monitor and Dreadnought herself, there aren't any really continuous design lines where you could say, look, this is pretty much an evolution of exactly the same kind of ship, because the Monitor as a type basically reaches a kind of a dead end for a couple of decades. It's then briefly resurrected by the US Navy, and then goes dead completely, and then is resurrected in the First World War by the Royal Navy, but in a very different role to that which the US monitors were mostly supposed to be partaking in. And of course you have all sorts of weird and wonderful designs in full-scale warships between Monitor and Dreadnought coming to service. There is, however, one, I would say, notional design type where you could argue, even though it's not necessarily a continuous line of development, there is a certain set of thinking leading to a particular layout showing up again and again, which you could consider to be a design trend. Although it doesn't end with Dreadnought, it essentially is the predecessor to the pre-Dreadnought, because when you look at any number of ships, I mean, you could even make a certain argument for some of the later US monitors, the ones with twin turrets, as in they have two turrets, not that they have two guns on the turret, although quite often they also have two guns in two turrets. So we're talking about the two turret design monitors. But then kind of leads on to sort of, at least in terms of chronology, something like Devastation and Thunderer. Then there's a few foreign designs that are quite similar, and then you've got the Trafalgar class. And what you're seeing there, generally speaking, is the idea of a ship of obviously somewhat varying capabilities, but a ship that is armed with a pair of twin turrets, one fore and one aft, that are supposed to engage enemy capital ships, which is essentially, barring various evolutions into secondary battery terms, the terminology that will define a pre-Dreadnought battleship. Two twin turrets, one fore, one aft, particularly turrets as opposed to barbettes, with the pre-Dreadnought styling coming in, obviously, with a massive secondary battery to deal with torpedo boats, potential hail of fire issues, and advances in armour technology allowing for a higher freeboard. But that base core principle of let's have four guns in two turrets to engage our enemies with heavy fire is just about kept alive by various designs in various navies between the late American Civil War and the early 1890s. Library of Context asks, at the turn of the 20th century, could you rank the biggest drivers that vastly increased gunnery range? Tactical doctrine, weapons technology, optics, mechanical calculators, or something else? I would say it's probably a close tie between weapons technology and optics, in that one kind of drives the other, but then it sort of switches around again. Mechanical calculators, not so much, because mechanical calculators, aka full fire control systems, post-date the turn of the 20th century by a little bit, and okay, it's only a little bit, but I think it's enough for the technological speed of advancement of the era. Tactical doctrine is mostly driven by the changes that are made possible by the other technologies, so it's more of a follower than a driver. Now, the reason I say weapons technology and optics are kind of the two is because optics is probably the single biggest driver at that exact point, but the drive for the optics is partly as a result of the weapons technology, although that weapons technology has actually been around for a little while. So the guns that were equipped on the biggest ships in the various navies for roughly, at the turn of the 20th century, for roughly speaking around a decade, had been reliably capable of ranging out considerably further than tactical doctrine said they should engage at. But there was no point in doing so because you had no way of accurately estimating the range, and therefore you weren't going to hit at those kind of distances, even though we're only talking 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 yards or something like that. But this had then led to a little bit of a problem, because as gun technology was getting more and more advanced quite rapidly, while armour technology was also advancing quite quickly from the beginning of the 1890s with compound armour through Harvey steel and then on to Krupp steel by the end of it, the simple fact was if you were going to keep engaging at 1,000 yards, 1,500 yards or so, while Krupp steel was a lot stronger than compound armour, a 12-inch 40 or 45 caliber gun at 1899, 1900 at that kind of range would still punch through any arbitrarily thick Krupp steel plate that you could reasonably fit on a ship, unless you wanted to go back to 20 years earlier, where everybody was sitting on tiny low freeboard armoured rafts with 2 feet of armour around them. And so something had to change, and you could see in the 1890s various people experimenting with optics in an attempt to increase range, because they'd looked at their guns and gone, well, we can actually fire considerably further. If we engage further out, then our armour's effectiveness is better, because obviously the shell's armour penetrating capabilities drop off. And if the enemy can't fire on us at that range, we can engage with impunity, and everything is great. And so once you get to the turn of the 20th century, the increase in gunnery range is almost entirely down to optics, because that's what enables the guns, which already can fire out several miles, to do so in a way that is actually tactically useful. And then, of course, once you start to improve optics as you get into the 20th century and optical technology, range finding, etc., gets better and better and better, now you start to reach the outer limits of what you can reasonably do with human approximation, just knowing roughly what the range is. And that's where you start to see the need for mechanical calculators. And once the combination of mechanical calculators and optics allows you to now, in theory, shoot out 5, 6, 7, 8 miles relatively accurately, then that now picks up the original driver of weapons technology and starts to compel people to start to develop even longer distance and more powerful guns. And tactical doctrine is just trying to keep up and adapt to all these other changes. Coneled asks, can you go into some detail about the hull issues of the Liberty ships, like why the temperature variation would cause cracking and how were these problems addressed? There were a number of issues with the Liberty ships which caused cracking. Individually, none of them might have caused significant issues, but combined they did. So part of it was that the Liberty ships were actually quite stiff for merchant ships. So there wasn't a huge amount of flex in their hulls compared to what you might do on some other vessels. This combined with the fact that obviously they're incredibly heavily loaded, basically loaded, as it turns out, slightly beyond tolerance, to get as much cargo moved as quickly as possible. So you now have a relatively stiff vessel, very heavily loaded, in fact overloaded. That's going to cause huge amounts of stress to build up. And again, partly to save weight and partly to make things simple, an awful lot of what was done on the Liberty ships involved straight lines and 90-degree angles, as opposed to on more traditional ships which would have a lot more curvature. And a very sharp angle is a stress concentrator. So now you have a stiff ship that's not moving a huge amount, which has a huge amount of weight on it, and now you have a perfect area for stress to concentrate. So all of this is quite bad. Of course, they're being mass-produced, which means that while there's still a certain degree of quality control, shipyards are employing and throwing onto the front lines of construction vast numbers of people, a lot of whom perhaps are less experienced, and welding, although it's not a brand new technology by World War II, is a relatively new technology for mass construction of ships. So you're going to get some welds and so forth not being done as well as they should be. So, of course, if you now have a stress concentrator and a faulty weld in that area, it's much more likely to fail. And then on top of all of that, the steel quality and the welds themselves as well are using a material which, as it turns out, particularly in very cold temperatures, much like the iron in the iron armor that we were discussing back a couple of weeks ago in the Full Storm of Iron video, that steel had a tendency to go from being ductile to brittle in cold temperatures. So now you have a heavily overloaded stiff ship with stress concentrators, welds that aren't particularly fantastic, and steel that in some circumstances can suddenly turn quite brittle. All of that combined would mean that, in combination with the welding, if you got a stress concentration somewhere that caused a crack to form, and it might not be initially a visible crack, it might be what they call a microfracture, that would start to spread. But then on a riveted ship, if you did have a hull plate that failed in that manner, then you might at worst get a crack in that hull plate, or you might, if the concentrator is on a riveted joint, you might start to see rivets fail. But both of these would be indicators of what's going on, but a crack can't spread to another riveted plate directly because they're not physically joined together on a molecular level. And if rivets start to fail, you go, oh, hang on a minute, there's obviously some stress building up here. Maybe we should, put another lapping plate or an extra plate there. But it essentially arrests the problem in a way that you can deal with. Whereas if everything is welded together, so from a material perspective is essentially a single continuous plate, the microfractures can spread and spread and spread and spread through multiple plates and welds until suddenly there now no longer is enough strength along the length of this microfracture to hold the plate together, and that microfracture becomes a visible fracture in terms of a massive failure, and that fracture has gone so far through the ship that the ship itself collapses, as you can see here, perhaps breaking in two. And to address this, well, essentially you can treat any one of those problems separately. You can't necessarily stop using all welded construction because that's part of the weight saving and speed of construction, but that's kind of, if you like, the cherry on the top. If it's kind of, once a fracture starts, it can spread catastrophically, but to stop that fracture in the first place, improve the training of your workforce, remove the stress concentrators, so start using rounded corners and maybe don't join everything up at one point. To a certain extent, you could try and use better quality steel, but there's limits to what you can produce in that respect, to be fair. You can also make the ship somewhat less stiff, a little bit more flexible, which you would see later on in the Victory ships. And maybe don't stick a couple of extra 1,000 tons of cargo on a ship when, all the paperwork says that you shouldn't do that. And on ships where you can't change some of those things because they've already been in production, then you can either weld or rivet additional strengtheners in areas where there have been repeated failures. And any combination of those will reduce the amount of failures and hopefully reduce the amount of stress down to a point where you don't have these kinds of issues. Andrew Dederer asks, I was pondering USS Essex and CSS Shenandoah. Both ships did devastating damage to whaling fleets. Now, these fleets were very rarely guarded, but they operated in very remote areas. Then I remembered that whalers have try-works on board, ovens that create massive plumes of smoke that could be smelled before being seen, according to various people. That would be just about the easiest ship to find in the open sea. So my question is, Was the French Jeune Ecole reacting to not only the advantages of steam power, in that warships could much more easily run down merchant ships, but also the increased detection radius of steam-powered merchant vessels? Naval ships would likely use much more expensive, cleaner coal, while merchants at sea would likely use cheap stuff which would throw off a bunch of fumes and smoke. So were the commerce raiding boys reacting only to new advantages in mobility, or did they think the prey had also gotten easier to find? To a certain extent. I mean, the Jeune Ecole was a paired doctrine, the idea being, of course, that torpedo boats could neutralise a battle fleet, and then your commerce raiding would economically cripple an enemy, because even if you didn't necessarily finish off the enemy battle fleet, a battle fleet can't catch fast commerce raiding cruisers. So if the enemy has put a lot of money into their battle fleet, the logic would go that therefore they wouldn't have enough money to put into a very large fleet of commerce protection cruisers, so your large fleet of commerce raiding cruisers will be able to outnumber their commerce protection cruisers, which allows you to primarily take out enemy merchant ships, and secondarily actually should give you an advantage on the high seas when it comes to dealing with ships that might try and stop you doing commerce raiding. But there is also something to be said in terms of the mobility advantage, because of course in the Age of Sail, a cruiser, although that's more specifically a role, but more generally a role that's done by a frigate, so let's say a frigate, a fifth rate, for example, that can outrun a ship of the line in light to medium winds. But if you have heavy winds and the seas get up quite high, then suddenly a ship of the line becomes faster than a frigate. So things are a lot more fraught. A capital ship, if you like, it can in some circumstances be faster than a commerce raider. And equally, although merchant ships as a rule are slower, the speed advantage of most warships, which are sail-powered, versus most merchant ships, also being sail-powered, and all dependent on the same winds, is proportionally less compared to a fast commerce raiding cruiser in the time of the Jeune Ecole, where you might be probably in the low 20s of knots, but your average merchant ship might be high single digits or very low double digits. So you're probably 2 to 3 times faster than a merchant ship. Whereas in the Age of Sail, you're not going to be 2 to 3 times faster than almost any merchant ship worth its salt. But equally, at the time of the Jeune Ecole, battleships are 14, 15, 16 knots. A few might be 18, because we're talking about just before the pre-Dreadnought period. At which point, if you can do 20 to 22 knots, well, again, you have a margin of speed advantage of maybe 25 to 30% consistently over a capital ship, which, again, in the Age of Sail, you don't have. So advantages in mobility are definitely a thing circa the Jeune Ecole. Being able to track down enemy ships or merchant ships, your targets, because of the increased detection radius, that's a advantage, but I don't think it's a main driver, because you've got to remember there's still quite a lot of either mixed power plant or just flat out sail powered merchant ships, even by World War I, let alone in the 1870s and 1880s, where there's going to be a lot more sail powered ships, so you can't spot them. The steamers, sure, you can spot, but not the majority of the world's merchant fleets are not steam powered just yet. But merchant ships would have gotten easier to find for a commerce raiding cruiser on 2 grounds. Firstly, because you're faster, you can cover more area. So if let's say you've got a 3x4 arbitrary unit search grid, so you have 12 search boxes that you can see. So let's define our grid by, this is the area that I can see from the top of my spotting facility, whatever that happens to be. Now, in the Age of Sail, if you had a merchant ship, let's say a third of the way along that, and they're gradually chugging along and sailing along, and you're in a frigate, with the vagaries of wind and so forth, if you're behind them, you might catch up with them, but there's a relatively low chance of it. And if you do catch up with them, well, if the wind is better over where they are than where you are, you're still not going to catch them. And even if the winds are equal or favourable to you, it's going to take you a while to overhaul them. Whereas in a steam-powered commerce raiding cruiser, you can probably cover that entire search grid well before the merchant ship gets out of it. So if there was a merchant ship in your search grid in the first place, you probably will find it, and with your speed advantage, you almost certainly will catch it. So there is a slight increase in catching capacity there. But the other factor is that there are still shipping lanes. There are ports from which lots of ships leave, and there are ports that lots of those ships are going to, and those are relatively well known. So if you're in a commerce raiding steam-powered vessel, you can go and raid ships on one shipping lane, and then when word gets out and either enemy warships start to show up or the merchant ships all duck for cover, and there's not a lot to be done there, in the Age of Sail, it would then be several weeks before you could head off to somewhere else, whereas in Age of Steamship, it might be a couple of days before you could be in a completely different location and a completely different set of merchant ships that you could raid. The almighty Hypnotoad asks, the Crow's Nest Officer Club, located in St John's, Newfoundland, has a periscope taken from U-190 sticking out through the roof overlooking the waterfront. Can you talk a little bit about U-190's service history, and if it was common for random chunks of U-boats to suddenly appear in clubs and bars? U-190 actually has a relatively pedestrian wartime career for the most part. She's a Type 9 C-40, so one of the more advanced versions of the Type 9, but not a hugely advanced version. There's Type 9 C-42, Type 9 Ds, etc. But in any case, she's completed roughly mid-war, and she does 6 war patrols in total, and up until almost the very end, her sole success is taking out a cargo ship, a mid-sized cargo ship, right at the start of her career. She goes on to do a whole bunch of additional patrols and occasionally fires torpedoes at things, but doesn't actually succeed in hitting or sinking anything. She then changes commander, and right towards the end of the war, so we're now talking 1945, she goes off to try and hunt enemy merchant ships off the Canadian coast under her new captain. And now, fast forward to less than a month before the war's end, and she's off the Canadian coast, having transited across the Atlantic, and she comes across a minesweeper, the Canadian minesweeper Esquimalt, which is doing what appears to be a relatively lackadaisical patrol, possibly because, well, it's fairly clear the war's going to be over very soon, so maybe they think it's not quite as dangerous. Who knows? But for whatever reason, Esquimalt isn't following most of the regular anti-submarine patrol procedures, but by luck or by judgment happens to almost near enough stumble over U-190, which panic dives and fires one of the acoustic homing torpedoes, the Zaukönigs, that she has on board. That manages to hit Esquimalt, which isn't necessarily quite so surprising, considering she probably didn't even know it was coming, but since Esquimalt isn't even a corvette, she's this titchy little minesweeper, she goes down incredibly quickly, which means that most of the crew survive the sinking, but about 2/3 of them don't survive exposure in the water until they're discovered by another minesweeper who just happens to run across them because the ship's gone down so quickly no one actually managed to get a signal out saying, hey, we're hit. U-190 then hangs around the Canadian coast for the remainder of the war, which is about 3 weeks, surrenders, and is taken into Royal Canadian Navy service as a training ship after they've done a little bit of showing off. But having done some anti-submarine training with the vessel, in 1947, she's pretty much paid out her capability, and there's other things the Royal Canadian Navy can be doing with the money, so they decide to get rid of her. But they kind of want to make a point. So they tow her out to where Esquimalt sank, and they line up an absolute cacophony of firepower ready to blow her out of the water. And this is all a big press event. It's going to be held on Trafalgar Day, and the idea is they're absolutely going to pound this thing into the ground. Unfortunately, for the big spectacle, it's supposed to start out with a basic strafing and aerial rocket attack and get worse and worse from there. But it turns out that some of the aircraft that are sent in are a little bit too good with their shots, and presumably somebody forgot to close all the hatches aboard because they launch a couple of rocket salvos, and the submarine almost immediately just goes over and sinks, and that's the end of the exercise. So everybody else who was hanging around doesn't really get a chance to do all that much. But before being sunk as a target, she was stripped of valuables, one of which was the periscope, and that's how it ended up at the Crow's Nest Officers Club. In terms of, was it common for random bits of U-boat to show up? It's not quite as common as you'd think, but a reasonable number of the more important bits of U-boats, particularly periscopes, tended to be pulled off of them before they were sunk, but after they were surrendered. So while it's not massively common to find random bits of German U-boat floating around, there's perhaps somewhat more isolated bits of U-boats that survived the war in various officers' clubs, antique shops and collectors' institutions than you would otherwise think. Ian Carr asks, were the World War II positions such as Commander-in-Chief of Royal Dockyards considered promotions or otherwise for the likes of someone like, say, Henry Pridham-Wippel, formerly of HMS Barham? Irrespective of that, what would their general reaction have been to being land-based? Well, it depends on why and how you're being land-based, because even in wartime, once you've had your term as commander of a ship or admiral of a formation, once that's come up and finished, in most circumstances, to be fair to other people, your successors, have to take your place. So when your shift is done, if you like, and obviously that, in peacetime that would usually be a very fixed amount, usually 2 years, maybe 3, depending on the navy. But in wartime it might be a little bit variable, so it might be 1 year and 9 months if, let's say, the ship is then due to go on an assignment for a particularly long period of time, or it's just entered a period of dry dock, and your tenure would run out while the ship is still in dry dock. Or it might be a little bit more, so let's say 2.5 years, let's say, if you were out in the middle of a very committed campaign when the 2-year marker came up, assuming we're using 2 years as a marker here. So at that point, it's very unlikely, especially once you get to the upper echelons of command, such as an admiral, that there's just going to be another vacant post for an admiral or a captain or a commodore or whatever, just waiting for you to step straight into. So being brought ashore briefly, that wouldn't necessarily be seen as all that bad, in principle. The two main things that would dictate how you react to it is going to be where exactly on land have you been placed, i.e. have you clearly been placed in a position which is almost certainly very temporary, i.e. the Admiralty has found gainful employment for you while they look for another at-sea appointment, or is it something where it looks like they expect you to stay for an exceptionally long period of time, an open-ended position, for example? And then also, where and what kind of position? Is it a position that is commensurate with either your rank or what you hope to be your next rank, or is it perhaps kind of, oh, well, he's a bit senior to be in command of this position? Because those two things together might give you some idea of, are they just essentially benching you for the rest of the war, or are they planning on getting you out as soon as humanly possible? The other thing which you'd have to take into account in wartime is how important is the position that you are in to the war effort. Because if it's some semi-random shore command that, okay, yeah, you need to keep the lights on and keep everything ticking over, but it's not particularly front line, as it were, then that would be seen as more of a side grade and a sign that the Admiralty maybe has lost faith in your ability to command at sea. However, if it's something it's not at sea, which might not be great for a career naval officer, but it does have an awful lot of importance to the war effort, then, much as you might like to be at sea, this might actually be seen as a promotion of sorts, i.e. the Admiralty is expressing its faith in you to do something that they consider to be vital. So, for example, in Pridham-Wippel's case, he was moved on first, well, pretty much for the rest of the war, to an extensive stay as Commander-in-Chief Dover. That early to mid-war was not seen as a particularly important posting, except for a brief period when it was thought that the Germans might actually try invading, in which case it was a very important post. But by the time he took up the position, in and of itself, it didn't seem to be particularly important. However, what he probably didn't know until he took up the position was that Commander-in-Chief Dover would be an absolutely key role when it came to the planning and execution of Operations Overlord and Neptune, aka the D-Day landings. So prior to that, Commander-in-Chief Dover, as I said, had a brief period of, well, what if the Germans invade, and another brief period when it came to the Dunkirk evacuations. But then, starting from kind of mid-43 onwards, it was one of the frontline planning stations for this incredibly vital invasion of Europe. So Pridham-Wippel would not have seen that as a demotion or a side grade. It was actually, again, while not a sea command, a very important command and something worth keeping on the books. DM Phoenix asks, it's the 1930s and you and Mrs. Drac are on holiday in Italy when you happen to witness the launch of a large warship of the Regia Marina. Something about the ship strikes you as odd, and you suspect that it might displace a bit more than what is publicly stated. On questioning, however, the local Italian naval officer assures you that this is definitely well within the naval treaty stipulations, and your request to measure, board, or even approach the ship are politely declined at gunpoint. Considering that the closest you can get to the ship is about a few hundred yards away, how would you go about definitively proving that the Italian Navy might not be being entirely truthful about the size of their warships? Well, although not to do with launch, a very similar situation actually occurred in real life, and here's a picture of it. This is the Gorizia, I think that's how it's pronounced, a Zara-class heavy cruiser, and as you can see from her bow, she's not in the best of health. She suffered a fuel tank explosion and had to put into Gibraltar for emergency repairs. And then this is her entering Drydock. Once she was in the Drydock was drained, repairs were commenced, and of course some of the British naval officers there went, methinks the Italians be lying about this ship's displacement. So in your scenario, witnessing the launch of the ship, this implies the ship is then in the water. That might make things a little bit harder. If I had been there, let's say a day before the launch, or I took some photos during the launch, that would make things a lot easier, because essentially the way to prove it from a distance is to establish some very basic measurements, such as length and breadth. Now, you can do that even once the ship is in the water, because obviously you can either have a look and do some basic trigonometry, or you can take some photos and have someone else do it. But essentially, once you've got some visual reference which would allow you to work out how wide the ship is and how long the ship is, then you can, if you've got access to photography of its underside, i.e. below the waterline, you can then get an approximation of the ship's lines and its underwater hull form, and then through some very basic calculations, albeit there's quite a lot of them, you can then work out how much volume does this underwater part of the hull displace in terms of cubic meters, or cubic feet if you want to work in imperial. And because you know the density of seawater, you can then work out, well, how much is that ship actually displacing? And this is what they did with the Gorizia. They basically went, she's this long, she's this wide, this is approximately her lines, this is her underwater hull form. Yeah, that's displacing a lot more than 10,000 tons. And you could, in theory, do all that from a few hundred yards away with a decent camera, because all you need is a handful of images to extrapolate from. Now, of course, with a few images, your extrapolation will be a bit more crude, so you'd be looking for something to be well overweight. So, for example, if a ship displaced, let's say, 10,500 tons, and you had 2 or 3 photos as the ship went into the water and a handful of photos of it at a quayside that you could ascertain its dimensions from, the margin of error would probably be enough that if someone swore blind it was 10,000 tons and your calculation said 10,500, you might give them the benefit of the doubt. Whereas if it was, say, a Littorio and the Italians swear blind that it's 35,000 tons and your calculations are spitting out 41,000, that margin of error is far too great. You might not necessarily be 100% confident it is 41,000 tons, but you're going to be very confident it's that plus or minus 1,000 tons or so. Now, of course, the problem with a ship just after launch is that it hasn't had the majority of its superstructural weapons stuck on it. So, in theory, if you wanted it to be really, really deceptive, if you're the shipbuilder, you could paint the anti-fouling paint, aka the waterline, considerably lower on the ship than it actually was going to be. And, of course, the ship's still going to sit higher than that without all this load on it. And then you can say, no, look, it's a really big ship, but look, it's only really going to displace this much, this rather shallow draft, and pretend that that would work. And you couldn't technically disprove that in the situation you describe unless you went back 6 months, a year, 2 years later after it had fitted out, and then you could look at it and go, well, yeah, according to this photograph, let's say you were looking at a Zara class, like Grizia here, according to this photograph, there should be 3 lines of scuttles and then a big gap all the way down to the waterline. But now it's coming in with 3 lines of scuttles and a small gap. So clearly this is sitting deeper in the water, and therefore they were lying before. So you could maybe do that, but that's assuming they were trying deceptive waterline painting practices. Leon Wu asks, what are the ugliest non-French warships in your opinion? Oh, there are a few. The Spanish Canarias class. I mean, I'm sorry. You took a perfectly fine-looking county-class destroyer, you stuck an industrial chimney factory on the back, or presumably possibly stole it from the Lexington class, and then what, you took a U-boat's conning tower and put it on the where the bridge is supposed to be? And the thing that makes this even more egregious than most is that if you actually look at photographs of the Canarias from the latter stages of her career in the middle of the Cold War, once they'd refitted her and given her 2 funnels as she should have had and a decent bridge, she actually looks really freaking good. So there was the core of a really nice looking cruiser in there, but in their initial form it's completely horrific. And then flipping things on their head a little bit now, yes, it is technically occurring post the time period the channel covers, but the original ship is from the time period the channel covers, and that would be the missile cruiser refits of Baltimore class cruisers. You can see the comparison here. Look, at the top is a nice, aesthetically pleasing heavy cruiser. At the bottom is an abomination unto the Lord, which will consign its designers to the burning lake of fire and sulphur from which there is no escape. And I'm going to demote the monitor Phare de Bruno out of being a ship and down to just being a boat with ambitions to leave it out of this, and I'm going to cap off this, I guess, 3-ship selection with HMS Inflexible of the Ironclad era. Now, yes, I like Inflexible for a number of other reasons, particularly her hull form underwater, but let's face it, from an aesthetic point of view, she is not exactly a looker. I mean, there are very few warships in the time period the channel covers where you can genuinely look at it and say, which way is forward? Michael Gilson asks, did you ever correspond or converse with James Hornfischer before his untimely passing? Yes, but only briefly. So I did have a little bit of email correspondence with him, and also in one of Wargaming's early fleet review, I think it was their fleet review, the first one that they did, they had myself, the Mighty Jingles, and Jim Hornfischer, amongst others, all on to present. And of course, as well as presenting the public-facing bit, we did spend a fair bit of time, if you like, backstage before and after the live bit of the show, all having kind of a general chat. So a little bit of email correspondence, probably 20-30 minutes of actual back and forth offline and say behind the stage while we were doing that presentation for Wargaming, but unfortunately that was pretty much it before, as you say, he untimely passed away. Zeranami asks, why the instantly recognisable distinct hull forms for each major navy? It seems to me that you can immediately recognise an American cruiser or a British battleship just by looking at their hulls. Was this a case of each navy optimising for different goals, or building off of diverging foundational knowledge as they evolved their own designs? It's a combination of both. So when a new kind of ship is developed, whether that be a pre-Dreadnought, a later ironclad, as you can see here, a light cruiser or general cruiser form or a destroyer or whatever. Generally, once a design for an approximate displacement and or role and or level of technology has been established, the various designers will, in different navies, will optimize what is possible to their own nation's requirements. So, for example, the Italians like speed, but don't really care that much about range, so they need lots of machinery, but not necessarily as much fuel. The Americans need lots of range, and although they like their armour, they're not particularly concerned with speed, so that's going to affect how they design their ships, and so on and so on and so forth. And then once they've locked in, roughly speaking, what they're going to be doing for this new kind of vessel, everything tends to iterate from there, with things getting slightly larger, armament getting played around with, but that basic initial hull form is used to start off the rest. And so you will see a fairly continuous line of designs and a lot of reuse of certain features, because, hey, if this feature works on this ship and we don't fundamentally need to change it all that much in the next design because we're maybe playing around with something else, why bother changing that? And so you get things that slip in to different nations' designs because, hey, they've worked in this ship, so we'll keep repeating it in the other ships because that lessens the amount of time we have to spend designing this new ship in terms of the basics, and just lets us go and work on the bits that are actually being upgraded. So, for example, from kind of roughly the C-class, late C-class destroyers of World War I onwards, almost every British cruiser has a knuckle or trawler bow. Now, that's a distinct feature of British ships. They came across the idea, it was a good and efficient solution for them, but unless you were buying from the British, very few people actually copied them, and so that became a rather distinct feature. The Americans, again, if you're looking at late World War I through the interwar and into World War II, they really like their flush decks, so that's a fairly distinct feature for American ships. But often what makes things very recognisable is a whole combination of features. So, for example, a propensity to stick aircraft right aft or amidships can distinguish ships of different nations, but then you combine that with hull lines. Is it flush decked? How many funnels? What kind of shape are the funnels? What kind of superstructure, etc. All of that blends together into, right, this is distinctly sharing features which are found in lots of different ships of that particular nation, therefore it is of that nation, which is why it can sometimes look a bit weird when you get smaller navies commissioning designs that are partly from one nation, partly from another in terms of design features, and you get these odd mishmashes. Sage of Irrelevance asks, in several dry docks you've mentioned there were some plans to modernise Nelson post-war, while Rodney was set to be scrapped owing to being in significantly worse material condition. Why was Rodney in a worse state than her sister? Was she run harder during the war? Were there problems with the quality of her build or materials, or something else? So it was a whole sequence of events. Both ships enter service in the late 1920s, but Rodney only has one lengthy refit in the interwar period, and it's only about a year or so after she enters service. She has some machinery problems which cause her to go into a long refit. After that, it's just a series of short maintenance refits and nothing particularly more than that. Whereas Nelson has a particularly long refit in 1937. So when you go into war in 1939, Nelson's had quite a nice refit and refresh less than 2 years earlier, whereas Rodney has been sailing for the better part of a decade without any extensive refit. So she's going into the Second World War at a bit of a disadvantage anyway. And then once you're in the war, Rodney, broadly speaking, tended to be assigned to duties that required her to do a bit more sailing around than Nelson, which spent a fair chunk of time as flagship of the home fleet, especially in the early part of the war. So generally speaking, Nelson wasn't quite as heavily used as Rodney during the war, and also, although both ships would be damaged by various enemy actions during the war, Nelson tended to take damage in a way that was quite spectacular and would then leave her out of service for several months. So she was mined twice and torpedoed once, and in each case she then obviously had to be taken out of service, which meant she missed active use in the war during that period, and of course would be refitted, damage would be patched up, and various other issues could be attended to. Conversely, Rodney, although she was hit by bombs and all sorts of people colliding with her and such like, each individual bit of damage tended to be somewhat on the smaller side. So either she would just be patched up and continue operations, or she might receive a brief stint in dock, just do a little bit more aggressive patching up of whatever it was that had damaged her. And so not only did various minor issues, which could then develop into major issues, not get addressed, but as time went on, she was obviously then physically out and about in service for longer and thus wearing more. So when you combine all of this together, it meant that by the end of the Second World War, Rodney was pretty much in a machinery exhausted state. Now, yes, she could have been modernised alongside Nelson, but she would have needed probably a year to a year and a half in Drydock to be refitted to a basic stage where you could then start thinking about fully modernising her. Whereas with Nelson, thanks to all the factors we just mentioned, she probably just needed a quick overhaul and then she'd be ready for modernisation. And oh boy, did the Royal Navy draw up a lot of plans, both during and immediately post-war, to cover the potential modernisations of Nelson. Everything from British refits to American refits, or Americanised refits, if you like. Elliot W. James asks, reading accounts of the Elizabethan Navy, I found crews armed with fire pikes that are listed separately from boarding pikes. What was a fire pike? Was it a boarding pike with a hook attachment to the head, similar to those used by firefighters to help pull down buildings, or was it something more interesting in a pyrotechnical or incendiary way? A fire pike is, of course, a long-range melter weapon that you give to an Eldar Exarch in Warhammer 40,000, but more seriously, I believe it's something more of the latter, because when you see references to them, they're often either colloquially called fire pikes, or if you look in inventories, specifically in Tudor ones, then you start to get an indication this is definitely some kind of incendiary. So, for example, there's the Wildfire House in Calais, which sounds fantastic, which in one of the inventories taken just into the reign of Edward VI, I believe, mentions that they have, amongst other things, 10 great wildfire casting pots of both sorts, implying that there are 2 different types of pots with which to cast wildfire, 3 small wildfire casting pots, 7 balls with short staves, 2,550 empty wildfire pots of both sorts, again indicating there are 2 kinds of deployment pot for wildfire, and 40 wildfire pikes. Francis Drake, during one of his accounts of attacking Spanish possessions in the Caribbean, says the following: the fire pikes, divided half to the one and half to the other company, served no less for fright to the enemy than light of our men, who by this means might discern every place very well, as if it were near day, whereas the inhabitants stood amazed at so strange a sight, marvelling what the matter might be, and imagining, by reason of our drums and trumpets, sounding in so sundry places, that we had been a far greater number than we were. So from that, I would surmise that a Tudor fire pike was a pike, so like any other pike, a kind of long distance stabby weapon, but equipped with some kind of holder for a incendiary, what the Tudors seem to refer to as wildfire, that appears to have been a relatively long burning material, because, well, from the mentions of the use of wildfire elsewhere, and specifically Drake's description of fire pikes, it seems to also be able to double as a torch. So that indicates it's burning quite brightly, but for an extended period of time, because they seem to be using them as big carrying torches during, marching around Spanish positions in the Caribbean. Whereas if it was a short burn incendiary, you wouldn't be able to do that. So at that point, now I'm not aware that anybody's actually got a surviving fire pike anywhere on display, but maybe they do. But I would imagine then you're looking at essentially a long hafted poking type thing, a pike, perhaps either with an attached holder into which some kind of material soaked in this wildfire could be placed, which would then burn away quite merrily for long periods of time, which would be quite useful in sieges as well, because you could then use it to apply fire to something you couldn't quite get close access to. And of course, in a combat, you can poke people with it, but also there's a risk of fire. Or possibly, perhaps like the thing you can see in the top right, possibly it was just a long stick with a holder for the wildfire on it and no particular stabbing potential. But I would tend to imagine that given the relative simplicity of the average pikehead, there probably was at least some stabbing potential to it as well. John McCarthy asks, some weeks ago you appeared on the Times Radio History channel in a video with the provocative title of Bismarck was not a supership. What kind of comments has the video gotten? And when will you release on your channel the video on the same subject? What additional details do you plan to cover? Yeah, that was a fun one because it was actually, as you can see from the second part of the title, it was going to be, and it is, 5 warship myths debunked. So I'd sent them a list, I think, of about 8 or 9 choices and said, look, here's a bunch of myths. Pick 5 and I'll happily talk about them. And then, of course, they decided to go with that one as the lead thing, because obviously that's the one of the ones that's guaranteed to get the most views, which it seems to have done pretty well, I've got to say, for them. So that's nice. But in terms of comments, most of the comments that have got a decent amount of votes are actually really nice. A bunch of you guys who clearly both watch this channel and watched that video as well. A few people, interestingly, I must be doing my job properly, because a few people came in like, oh, sounds good, Drac hates Bismarck, blah, 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 all the standard Bismarck talking jokes. But a bunch of you, and some of you I even recognise from the comments over on this channel, were like, well, actually, and then proceeded to educate to varying levels of success the people in question in the comments about either the fact that the sinking of Hood was pretty much a lucky hit, and or that when people are, Drac just hates German people, they're like, no, actually, Drac has pointed out many times that Bismarck was a powerful ship. She was just an inefficient ship, which is spot on. That is exactly right. But one of my favourite analogies I use these days is, if you put a heavyweight boxer in a middleweight championship and they kind of do okay, well, great, they've done okay, but it's not particularly impressive considering they've got a massive weight advantage on everybody else. But when I eventually get round to doing my full analysis of Bismarck, I've actually changed things up a little bit, because at first, and for a very long time as I've been working through this script, I was planning on going through a detailed breakdown, sort of almost not quite system by system, but area by area. So primary firepower, secondary firepower, torpedo defence, armour layout, fire control layout, etc., 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 and going, okay, this is a good thing about the design, but this is a bad thing about that bit of design. Move on to the next. This is the good points about this choice. This is the bad points about this choice, and move on to the next. However, I've since decided, which of course is meaning I'm having to partially rewrite the whole thing again, that I'm actually going to try to do a compare and contrast with its approximate contemporaries. So for the US and the UK, that's going to be obviously King George V class. I haven't quite decided whether I'm going to do North Carolina or South Dakota class, because there's a few differences obviously between those two. And I'm going to try and include the Littorios and Richelieus as well. So rather than me going just on and on and on and on and on about German engineering, rather what I'm going to do is say, okay, let's say, for example, the main armament. So Bismarck has 8 15-inch guns. Compared to her contemporaries, the Italians have 9, the French have 8, so they're the same, but in a slightly different layout. The British have 10 guns, but they're 14-inch. The Americans have 9 guns, and they're 16-inch, regardless of whether it's North Carolina or South Dakota. And then we can look primarily at Bismarck, and, for example, say, okay, well, Bismarck's guns could elevate this far and shoot this range, and the armor-piercing capability at 20,000 yards, which I think is my kind of default go-to for battleship gun comparisons, is this, and so on and so forth. And then briefly at the end of each descriptive section for a part Bismarck system say, and as well as, pointing out the strengths and weaknesses, going, and this compares with its contemporaries thusly. So compared to the other 15-inch guns on Richelieu and Littorio, how far could they range? How fast could their shells go? What were their armor-piercing capabilities at 20,000 yards? And the same thing for the 14 and the 16-inch guns. And then that puts Bismarck, compared to her other contemporaries, in first, second, third, fourth, whatever, with the caveats of this was a particular strength or weakness of those particular weapons. Fahrender Ritter asks, how did navies in the Age of Sail handle duels of honour in terms of rules and practice, and how inconvenient were wounds and deaths due to duelling? It depends very much on the navy in question, because in the early US Navy, for instance, there was a serious problem with people being wounded out of service or getting outright killed in various duels. It seemed the response to almost anybody getting in any way, shape or form insulted was like, right, pistols at dawn, or sometimes shotguns at dawn if they were particularly suicidal, and so on and so forth. But in other navies, there was varying amounts of dueling. Some navies had a bit of a problem with it, like the US Navy. Others had previously had problems with it and as a result had clamped down on it, but also the type of weapons being used varied from navy to navy. The early US Navy, for example, heavily favoured the use of large caliber pistols, which tended to inflict some pretty devastating wounds at close range if you actually managed to hit your opponent, whereas some of the older services, which had, still had connotations either with just tradition or with aristocracy in the officer cadre, would fight duels more with swords, and that would usually be to first blood, in which case the chances of actually dying, well, not entirely removed, considering this is, we're talking 17th, 18th century here, from infection and so forth, but it was considerably less likely that you would die as the result of a cut from a cutlass or a saber than it was if someone had just blasted you with, a 45 or 55 caliber lead ball. But broadly speaking, the other reason why you don't see quite as many duels in, say, the French, Spanish or British navies at the time the US Navy is having its problems is because those navies are, apart from the US Navy, involved in an awful lot of conflict. And during times of conflict, although there would be the occasional duel, most of the time some senior officer, if people were getting het up and wanted to have a duel, a senior officer would step in and basically tell them to knock it off, stop acting like spoilt children, there's a war to fight, and if you really want to go and shoot or stab somebody, go and shoot a Frenchman or a Spanishman or an Englishman, depending on which navy you happen to be in. But in times of peace, or if the insult was grievous enough and a duel was agreed upon, it would still have to take place, if you like, off work time, which, if you were at sea a lot, meant you might have to wait months before your duel could actually be fought, especially if perhaps you'd offended or been offended by someone in a different ship. You challenge them to a duel, okay, fine, but you've got 4 months worth of sailing, and the ship that your now opponent is on is dispatched on another mission. You get sent off on, say, another 6-month voyage to India or somewhere like that. You might show up back in the UK if you're in the Royal Navy a year and a half after you've issued that challenge, only to find the person you challenged has actually been ashore for 8 months, but 2 weeks earlier had shipped out for another long-distance mission to the South Atlantic and won't be back for another year. And whether or not you're still there in time for the duel is another matter entirely when they get back. So duels therefore tended to be a little bit further and far between for navies that were a bit more active, whether in times of peace or war. And officially, most navies did try and discourage the practices of dueling because usually it was between officers, and the Navy would usually have made some kind of investment of time and or money in those officers, so getting them wounded or out of service or killed or temporarily inconvenienced was not in the Navy's best interests. Nick Brodar asks, during the World War I Battle of the Falklands, had von Spee pressed his attack before the British were able to raise steam, could he have defeated them in detail? Unfortunately not, because there were a couple of British ships that already had steam pressure even by the time von Spee was sighted, so they would be able to manoeuvre freely. But the other problem is that although the British ships were not at full steam, they were at short notice to steam, so by the time von Spee had made his way safely from the position he was in when Canopus opened fire around and into the entrance of the harbour, assuming that Canopus didn't hit him on the way, then while the British ships would be stationary and therefore easier to hit, the way that Stanley Harbour is set up would mean that he would be caught in a crossfire as he passed into the harbour entrance. So he'd be caught at essentially point-blank range by the mass fire of a fleet that outnumbered and outgunned him by a considerable amount, and he would only have essentially one line of fire onto the battle cruisers, and the battle cruisers would have a straight line of fire at point blank with 12-inch shells straight back at him. So he would have been a slightly harder target to hit, but then on the other hand, the British ships not really moving all that much, both in terms of pitch and roll, would have had incredibly steady gun platforms to fire back at him, and as I said, just sheer numbers of guns from multiple directions. Where exactly does von Spee aim his guns? Because if he's coming into the narrow entrance of Stanley, then he can only fire with his forward guns until he's got well enough in to pass by some of the outer British ships, so his firepower is doubly reduced, and the chances of him making it substantially into the harbour before lots of British shells start hitting him is pretty remote. In a lot of other harbours, he would have had a much better chance, but Stanley is a very, very narrow and constricted approach, which would mean, as a shooting gallery, okay, for both sides, but one side has more firepower, but also von Spee doesn't have the visibility to be able to conduct a long-range bombardment or even a medium-range bombardment of the British ships. He has to come into point-blank range, whereas the British, because obviously they have spotters on the hills, they can actually relay information, so they can fire on and potentially damage his ships before von Spee can actually directly see and engage his own targets. Andre de Coult asks, the World War II Hunt class destroyers, how did they manage to get it initially so badly wrong? The extremely short version is the massive amount of overwork that the Director of Naval Constructions Department was undergoing during the early part of the war. The longer version, for those of you who don't know, the initial Hunt class had major stability problems to the point that halfway through building the batch ones, they suddenly realized, if we don't take something off and put a lot of weight in as ballast, these things are just going to flip upside down as soon as they go into the water. And what seems to have happened is a combination of two factors. Firstly, you had the initial design, and then lots of little bits kept getting added on, but each individual bit was only a little bit away, a few tons here, a few tons there, maybe we can adjust a bit here, adjust a bit there. And that caused a creep in overall displacement and especially top weight. This then combined with the fact that a few bits and pieces were added by, let's just say, people who didn't necessarily fully understand what they were doing. So, for example, there's a quadruple pom-pom, which you can see in this photo on this particular Hunt class, is just aft of the funnel. Now, quad pom-poms are actually quite heavy things, all things considered, and when the initial request, hey, can we add a quadruple pom-pom to this design, came across the desk, the designer in question said, well, yeah, but the weight is about equivalent to a pair of 4-inch guns, so I suppose if we take off the aft superfiring 4-inch mount, which you can also see there, then we replace it with a quad pom-pom. Well, it'll have two twin 4-inch and a quad pom-pom. Okay, well, if that's what you want, we can do that, certainly. And then he got a note back saying, well, no, what we meant was you are putting a quad pom-pom on this design in addition to the 3 twin 4-inch. And being an order is just like, I guess we'll try and find something from somewhere or other. But then the other problem came with the stability calculations themselves. So what seems to have happened is that standard Royal Navy procedure for determining the stability of a design is that the quite complex calculations, because bear in mind we're still talking everything pretty much being done by hand, would be done by two separate people, and then they would look at each other's work, and if they agreed, fantastic, and if they disagreed, they'd have to find out why have they come to two different results. Due to the working pressures in the design department, because bear in mind they're not just working on the Hunt class, they're working on a whole bunch of other warship classes, what seems to have happened in that case is only one person was given the job, and they looked at the design and they seem to have taken a slightly too high point of reference as the waterline. And then everything they did from there was in error, because they were thinking the ship was going to be sitting a lot lower in the water than it actually was. And then it seems that somebody went, we should have a second set of calculations to go with it. That's what the regs say. You over there, quick, do another set of calculations. But with the time pressures that are going on, the second guy just went, where's your work? Right, I'm just going to copy that. Yeah, great. Look, okay, we've got two design checks. They agree. Fine. Let's proceed with the the scheme. When one guy had made an error, the other guy had copied the error unintentionally. That is exactly why you were supposed to have two separate design checks. But in the pressures of early war work, as I mentioned, it all went unheeded until basically the first batch were under construction, and then somebody went, you know what, I don't think we can actually fit more armament than a Black Swan class sloop in a ship that is lighter than a Black Swan class sloop, and still expect the thing to stay upright. I'm on a double O. Oh dear. And the funny thing is, once they resolve that by making the subsequent runs a little bit beamier to accommodate the additional weaponry, the design then actually worked pretty well. But that first batch was a very nearly disaster. So very, very quickly disaster averted, just. Paul Frederick asks, in the movies, the captain will sometimes order all ahead flank or just flank speed. Is this a real naval term? And if so, what is it derived from or based on? It is a real naval term, but it's a naval term that's found pretty much exclusively in the US Navy and navies that take inspiration from the US Navy. So you wouldn't hear flank speed uttered on a Royal Navy ship in the Second World War, for instance. And what it means is essentially all power. So in Star Trek or Star Wars terms, all power to the engines. It's literally drive the ship as hard as you possibly can and essentially forget about any damage you might be doing. So whereas your full speed or top speed, all ahead full, something like that, that would be proceed at the maximum rated ship's power, i.e. design power output. Flank speed is essentially firewall it, redline it, do whatever you need to do, but I want every single horsepower this ship can possibly generate to the screws right this minute, preferably yesterday. And in terms of where it's from, it's not entirely clear as far as I understand it. I've seen two of the more plausible theories come forward. There's a few other I find slightly less plausible, but the two I find the most plausible are either that it means flank as in flanking speed, i.e. perhaps the battle is joined and everything is on a knife edge, and where you might actually win or lose the battle is, can we get around the flank of the enemy, either side of the enemy, basically can we cross their T, in which case, flanking speed, absolute all power, we've got to get there, and we've got to get there first. Possible, seems a little bit complex. The other one, which also potentially seems plausible to me, is that it derives from horse racing, where obviously a horse will normally be encouraged to run at its full speed, but when it's in the last stretches and perhaps you're going neck and neck with your competitor and you absolutely want to get over the finish line first, you want that last bit of reserve out of the horse, you start whipping them on the flanks, unfortunately, which is supposed to drive the horse to that little bit more adrenaline-fueled speed, and hence flank speed would essentially be like you're thrashing your ship on the flanks to get it to go as fast as you possibly can. which seems a little bit simpler and potentially therefore more likely to me. Greg Parker asks, in the video Naval Logistics, Where Does the Food, Fuel and Ammo Go? At 3 minutes 35 seconds, what are the domes erected on the ship in the centre of the photo? These are preservation domes. So what you're looking at here is on the right USS Iowa, centre USS New Jersey, and on the left USS Wisconsin, BB 61, 62 and 64. And what you might be able to tell just by looking at it is that New Jersey, the middle ship here, actually still has a lot of her 40mm gun tubs. You can particularly see that on the bow. It's slightly harder to see what exactly is present further aft. But as a result, because there are presumably 40mm guns in there, and obviously also the gun tubs are connected to and through the deck, these have been covered in these domes to keep both the guns preserved and to stop water and other things getting into the ship via them. So when you look at a lot of World War II ships that are in mothballs at various places in the 50s and 60s, and this I think is from the early 60s, you'll actually see these domes proliferate quite a bit. Vintage Car History asks, after 4 years I finally gave your channel a shout out. I waited that long as most of my early subscribers came from your channel, so there was no point in giving you a shout out until I had some subscribers who weren't familiar with you. So if you don't mind, would you give me a shout out for what I do? I don't mind at all. So for those of you who might be interested in old cars and the history of old cars and how they came to be and why they came to be in the many and varied and slightly odd forms that they sometimes came in, well, Vintage Car History is your place to be. There it is on the screen. Fairly easy to follow and find if you stick it in YouTube's search algorithm. And of course, the gentleman behind Vintage Car History, I have both communicated with extensively over the years, as he is a long-time subscriber and fan of this channel, and also met in person when I did my North America tour. So I can vouch for the fact he's the most excellent person in person as well, I suppose. So yeah, go and give that a look. And finally, for this half of the episode, the Fighting Irish American Destroyer asks, it's well known that during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Admiral Halsey believed that the centre force had either been annihilated or was running away during the Battle of Sibuyan Sea. And if you look at the battle damage assessment given to him by the aviators, it would be easy to come to that same conclusion. However, given the tendency of aviators to overstate their claims, and the fact this has been well documented by that point in the war, why did Halsey take their claims at face value? Well, let's just say the Japanese were usually fairly able to read the minds of American fleet commanders, at least in terms of ascertaining what strategies the American fleet commanders may or may not be more susceptible to. Of course, that doesn't necessarily help you when the mind of the enemy fleet commander is Hulk smash Japanese fleet. Has the fleet to do so, but at least you know what's coming. Anyway, when it came to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese knew that Halsey really, really wanted to be involved in a decisive carrier battle, and so they planned to offer him up the Northern force as a decoy. Ironically enough, as it happened, every single Japanese force involved in the Battle of the Leyte Gulf was spotted before Ozawa's decoy force, which was the one force the Japanese wanted to be spotted, and they didn't want all the others to be spotted. But nonetheless, when Kurita was under attack at Sibuyan Sea, you have, of course, Musashi falling back and finally being mobbed to death, but also Kurita's forces are temporarily withdrawn. He basically turns back to get his forces out of range of a potential further follow-up strike, because the Americans don't quite realise that they've been mobbing essentially almost entirely just Musashi. But of course, from Kurita's perspective, he's looking at just how much damage Musashi has taken thus far and going, if another air wave shows up that is not going after Musashi, that could do a lot of damage to a number of my other vessels. So by pulling away for a bit, the idea was that, well, if the Americans launch again, they either won't be able to find me or I'll be too far west and they won't be able to reach me. And then I can double back, which is what he actually does. And that's how you get the Battle of Samar. But when Halsey hears about this, obviously you have the slightly overblown claims from the aviators, but you also have the fact that the last thing he's seen from Kurita is what's left, or whatever he thinks is left of Kurita's force, retreating off to the west. And Halsey is convinced that actually, as has been historically the case in every other major battle fought with the Japanese fleet thus far, the main strike has to come from the carriers. So a strike by surface ships, which gets relatively easily overwhelmed and then forces them to run away, well, that matches exactly what he'd expect the Japanese to do to decoy him away from the true threat, which would be the aircraft carrier force. So everything's lining up roughly as he thinks the Japanese would actually run this engagement. Try and decoy him with ships that don't matter so much to sneak in an attack by the ships that do. So then later on in the evening, when the last report he has is, well, some of Kurita's ships have been sunk and the rest are running away, and then he finally gets the report, hey, there's a bunch of Japanese carriers coming in from the north, Halsey immediately goes, aha, well, clearly this is validating all my views. This is the sneaky Japanese carrier force that they were trying to get past me. That's why they sent this other service force in first. I will now go and have my glorious carrier battle and destroy the main Japanese striking arm, which is kind of what the Japanese wanted him to assume anyway, without the whole, hitting center force first. But away Halsey went. So essentially, although it didn't happen in quite the order the Japanese wanted to, what they ended up giving Halsey was exactly what he wanted, and because he wanted it, he expected it, not because necessary intel said that's what should be coming. And it essentially became a case of wish fulfillment. He'd been given what he thought was his dream on a plate, so he was going to chase that and not really question all that much. Whereas if you'd had kind of the reverse, and let's say center force had been the decoy group of carriers, and the northern force was the actual strike force of ships and was going to try and go and do a long run around the east of the American fleet, then he might not have taken the bait so much. So, if he'd hit a carrier-based center force and then seen them drawing off and then got reports of a surface force, he probably would have gone, yes, we're clearly now they're trying to distract me from finishing off their carriers. I shall pursue the carriers through the San Bernardino Strait and finish them off. And then the center force will be like, well, where's he gone? I guess we'll keep on going. But yeah, it's in some ways, it's a classical case of give the enemy what they're expecting, dash what they really want, and they will follow it and assume that anything else that's potentially contrary or contrarian information must be false, because if it was true, then they were not going to get what they want. And thus ends part 1 of the last Drydock of 2024. Thank you very much for listening. See you in part 2.